and we'll start with a salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And welcome, Mr. Giannini. If you could take roll, please.
Ira Skobdal,
Here.
Noah Levy, Thomas Mulder, Peggy O'Neill,
Here.
Sarah West,
Here.
Jerome Kirazi,
Here.
Lorna McFarland.
Here.
Okay, well, we have a quorum. And Director Ford, do we have any agenda modifications this evening?
No, Chair, we have no modifications.
Well, okay, good. Then we'll move right on into public comment on non-agenda items. And at this point, members of the public that would like to address the commission on matters that are not on tonight's agenda but are under our jurisdiction, please approach the podium, or if you're online, please press star 9 to raise your hand. And I'll go with those in the room first. So, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. My name's Joanne McGarry, and I came from Arcata on the bus because I've been coming to the County Board of Supervisors meetings and asking about particular issues, including what's on the agenda tonight, but I'm not going to talk about that at this moment. What I do want to say is I attend a lot of public meetings, and I do my best to be clear and articulate and speaking into the microphone. And I discover that sometimes either speakers or people on the dais, I'm a little hard of hearing. And so I would like to ask that everybody speak loudly enough so that I can hear what you have to say, because sometimes it can get a little insular in this. And I do plan to maybe come more often to these meetings, because I used to come to these meetings and kind of fell off, but I'm kind of committed to getting more active and involved in finding out what's going on in our community in regards to how we're planning for the future. So I just wanted to sort of introduce myself to you, and I will be speaking up later on another agenda item. So thank you for speaking up loudly so I can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and for that reminder. I know sometimes when we're watching our own meetings online after a meeting, I realize that we can be difficult to hear. So I don't see any hands up online. Okay, I'm going to close public comment on non-agenda items. I'm going to go to the consent agenda. We only have 2 items on consent, and there are action summary for review, one from September 18th and one from October 3rd. I'm going to check with the commissioners first. Do any of the commissioners have any comments or questions related to the action summaries on consent? Seeing none, I'm going to check with the public, and I don't see anybody in the room or online that has comments on those. So as those are the only matters on consent, I will ask for a motion.
I'll make a motion. Can I make a motion for both of them?
I think you can, yes.
Okay, I'll make a motion for both September 18th and October 2nd action summaries to approve.
So I have a motion from Commissioner O'Neill.
I'll second.
Second from Commissioner Kiriazi. Voice vote, please. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. Motion passes. We'll now move to item F, public hearing. This is a public hearing and hopefully a decision on, first public hearing item is the draft employee housing ordinance. So, and we'll have a staff report.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Augustus Groshaw, working for the Department of Planning and Building and presenting on the employee housing ordinance. Just waiting a moment for my screen to be shared. Excellent. So let's understand what we're talking about. Employee housing is any portion of any housing accommodation or property upon which a housing accommodation is located, which fits the definition of either linked employee housing or unlinked agricultural employee housing, and it needs to serve 5 or more agricultural employees. Linked employee housing is fairly simple. It just needs to be maintained in connection with any work or any place where work is being performed. And unlinked agricultural employee housing is a little bit more detailed. First, it needs to serve agricultural employees exclusively. It must be temporary or seasonal. However, there are exceptions that can be made to certain situations with permanent residency. It can't be single-family or multifamily dwellings, hotels, motels, or inns, with certain exceptions that essentially link the dwelling units to employment of the occupants or otherwise treat agriculturally employed occupants differently from other occupants. It needs to be not provided by an agricultural employer and not maintained in connection with any work or workplace, because then it would be linked. And if both the exceptions to exceptions allowing permanent residency instead of seasonal, and the exceptions for single-family dwellings, et cetera, that needs to be linked employee housing and therefore must be maintained in connection with a work or workplace. In addition, those employee housing varieties get further cut down into a couple more varieties. That would be small-scale employee housing and large-scale employee housing. Small-scale employee housing is employee housing providing accommodations for 5 to 6 employees. It can't be a boarding house, hotel, dormitory, or other such business that would differentiate it explicitly from a typical single-family residence. And for the purposes of all permitting, they are equivalent to single-family residential uses. So we've made a few code changes, basically. First, updating the use type to include small-scale employee housing, the single-family residential use type, and updating the zoning permitted uses to include small-scale employee housing in a couple places. Large-scale employee housing provides employee housing serving up to 36 beds in a group quarters or 12 units, each of which would be designed for single-family households. I will highlight that that does not have a minimum of 6 employees, so small-scale employee housing also qualifies as large-scale employee housing if such a situation needs to arise. And large-scale employee housing is equivalent to agricultural uses for all permitting use purposes. We've made similar changes, updating the general agricultural use type and elsewhere in the code. So there's a third type. This one is sort of a subset / modification of large-scale employee housing. This is eligible agricultural employee housing developments. We are going to require a ZCC in agricultural land uses for these. This is unique from other typical uses because other ones would typically require things to match the zoning rather than the land use. State code requires this to be applicable in agricultural land uses. And this is only applicable inland, not coastal. These eligible employee housing developments are meant to serve up to 36 units as opposed to the 12 units of large scale. Again, each designed for a single use by a single family household. This can't be dormitory style housing. It must be maintained and operated by a qualified affordable housing organization. It needs to have no hazards on site, essentially. We get into a little bit more detail in the code itself, but that's the overarch. And it needs to comply with all the development standards from section 314 -47.3.14.3, which we are authorized to require per section 1702.21.8E of state code. Let's get into those development standards real quick. These need to be objective for ministerial review. So we're requiring sufficient parking, which we're calling either that which matches the residential uses in our parking code, or one space per unit, whichever is less. Sufficient potable water, which we're calling 35 gallons minimum per day. However, that is a little bit low, so you could consider raising that up. That number we have pulled from a separate state code that restricts a similar kind of development, but it's a bit different and we're not required to be 35 specifically. It also requires functional indoor plumbing and a wastewater management system. That system can either be an on-site wastewater treatment system or a public sewer. Additionally, it needs sufficient and consistent electricity, which we've determined is potentially 20 kilowatt hours per day. We've determined that based on average of a few recent years of residential electrical usage data, and bumped that up just by a couple watts to make it a little bit more flexible, I'd say. And it needs sufficient per person / per household living space, which we are calling 500 square feet per household. And once you add a second person, each person gets an additional 250 square feet. So 2 people requires 750. So these changes were made in accordance with Housing Element Implementation Measure number 47, which promised to amend the zoning regulations in accordance with Health and Safety Code sections 17021.5 and 17021.6. We've also incorporated sections 17008 and 17021.8 because they're intertwined with those previous sections that we were proposed to incorporate. And we've also added in section 17021 just because it's related and it still applies to us. Planning staff recommends that the Planning Commission adopt the resolution, which does the following: finds the proposed ordinances are exempt from environmental review, finds that the proposed project complies with the general plan, local coastal plan, and zoning ordinance, and recommends that the Board of Supervisors adopt the ordinances. Thank you, and planning staff is available for any questions y'all may have.
Yes, Commissioner O'Neill.
Just a couple things. Can you explain to me why an affordable housing organization has to maintain the units and not, say, the employer?
For eligible agricultural housing developments, those are kind of an exception for higher density uses, which state law requires to be maintained by a housing
So
organization.
that's not something that's optional.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, what happens if the employees exceed 36? Because everything was up to a certain number, but then it went to up to 36. What if they had 40 employees? What happens?
They wouldn't all be living in that particular housing arrangement. That is how many units can be permitted. So conceivably, multiple workers could share a household, but then we would be running into the question of, is it really a single-family household anymore? Like, the definition of family would accommodate for it, but it's up in the air, I'd say.
So this ordinance doesn't apply to, say, fire camps?
Not necessarily, I don't believe so.
Okay. Because I saw the word tents, whereas in the definition, and so I wondered.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my questions.
Thank you. Other commissioners? Commissioner Curriasi?
I was curious how, in practice, the farm employee piece of that constraint is applied. Like, can something be permitted for farm employees and then end up housing non-farm employees? Or, I mean, I just kind of more curious about the actual implementation of that.
I would say no, because then it would be a use violation. State has a very broad definition of what an agricultural employee is. Like, a lot is agriculture, but if you're, to go on a wild hypothetical, if you created a housing or place that ends up being to house your office employees, that would no longer be agriculture and would therefore not be in line with state code or our code.
Thank you. And that would rely on complaints, presumably, to,
Conceivably.
yeah.
Yes. Commissioner
was-
McFarland?
Just wondering if you mentioned for one person it's a minimum of 500 square feet, and then two people it bumps up to 750. And I was just wondering, is that written in state code somewhere, or did we come up with that on our own? And I'm just curious because I've definitely, when you're like a grad student, we've had more than one person living in 500 square feet, and it was fine. So I guess I would express flexibility there if possible.
We have flexibility to alter that. That's just what we consider to be comfortable. Like, this is a high-density situation. It's an exception for a lot of things. We can lower those bounds a little bit, but we would need to kind of agree upon them and do that with the knowledge that these are single-family residences. They should ideally be able to support a family.
Yeah, just something that the commission can think about, but I've lived in small places before and made it work, so.
Yeah, those small places often have common areas, though, that are part of your usage, right?
One time, yes, one time, no.
Okay,
But we were out
Right.
doing things most of the time, so just an option.
okay. I'm going to bring you back to the water supply. It seems there could be a variable number of these units, so I didn't quite understand how the 35 gallons.
I believe 35 is per person. But let me check real quick.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the math. 30,
Yeah, it's at least 35 gallons per day per person.
that's not a lot of water. Okay,
Americans use a lot of water.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would say that's a minimal number. Okay. Any other questions? Before I open public hearing, yep, go ahead.
Back to the size of the unit, I have built a 550 square foot ADU, and it's a laundry room, a kitchen, a living room, a pretty good sized bathroom, and a pretty good sized bedroom. So that's for one person, and then, you know, a bedroom could be like 10 by 12, which is 120 square feet. So to say, I think it's getting pretty costly if you're, unless you're living there year round, I don't know, I guess year round, maybe that's a pretty good size place for an employee housing. Because in some cases, you get a bedroom and a bathroom, and that's like in a motel, and people live in those during work times. So it could be smaller.
Well, when we come back to that, I'm going to open a public hearing to see if anybody here would like to address the commission on this item. If you're in the room, please approach the podium. If you're online, please press star 9 to raise your hand. And I don't see anybody in the room. No hands online. So I'm going to close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for any other questions or discussion.
Do you have, Commissioner Scavdall, a recommendation on per person per day gallon minimum?
No, I don't. I just know that if it is a family, if there are children, you know, there's cooking, washing, showers, bathroom facilities. So I don't know if it's 50 gallons. 35 seems a bit tight, but we're also trying to conserve, so.
Excuse me, sorry. I did look this up yesterday just to get
Yeah.
some additional fresh information. I believe 50 gallons per person is appropriate as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then also on size, I mean, I know we just did a tiny homes ordinance, and tiny homes are becoming kind of more, you know, prevalent. And it would seem, again, if you're trying to do workforce housing or employee housing, that something, at least allowing them something on the scale of what we would consider to be a tiny home might also be appropriate. Could just be a couple. You know, you were talking about one bedroom. Doesn't mean they all have to be that small, but we're setting a minimum, and I don't recall what we said the square footage of our tiny homes were. We could go to 300 square feet, or
Yeah, they can go down to 300 or maybe 400, somewhere in that range.
yeah,
I mean, just for comparison, the typical garage is 20 by 20. That's
Right.
400 square feet.
right.
I mean, I'd be happy with the, somewhere in the 300 to 400 range, but I do like how you had if there's an additional occupant, some additional square footage. I think that's fair, or you have a number that's like for 1 to 2 people, and then anything above that. I think something in there I could work with.
Commissioner Curriasi.
On the, in terms of the additional square footage per occupant, that's during design, so you would just come up with, but presumably more people could very well occupy that space. And again, it would, I guess, come back to complaints if somebody was concerned about that. And so I guess maybe on the same vein, I'd maybe question the 250 square feet per additional occupant. So I'm thinking 3 occupants and 1,000 square feet. That's my home, and I could imagine more than 3 occupants.
I agree. Yep. So do we have a proposal, some direction to staff that we want to try to assemble here?
Can we make the direction a little nebulous, like for staff to review the numbers, come up with a lower number that is in line with the tiny home ordinance, Or do you need a solid number from us?
You can give us that direction, and we'll take it before it goes to the board. It would be better for you to give us a concrete recommendation, though, to take to the board.
What if our concrete recommendation is a range, which gives you guys the flexibility to ground truth that final number?
That would be good.
Then that would be my proposal.
So what would be the range?
3 to 4?
Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about, and I think that's consistent with our tiny home ordinance. I
And
just
then-
don't have it exactly in front of
Do you
me.
want to have the added square footage for added occupants?
I think that seems fair. I just don't think we need to go as much as 250 per additional occupant.
So a typical bedroom is 10 by 10?
Mhm.
Or 10 by 12 is a fairly good sized one. And then if you add a little bit more to the living area or the kitchen area, I think you could go easily with 120 to 150 square feet for an additional person.
Yeah.
I think we could support that, so
Yeah, I agree.
Commissioner West, so 150 square feet.
Or, oh, sorry, go.
Oh, I was also going to add, I'm in support also of increasing the water usage per day when we're talking about.
To, yes, staff,
Okay.
yes.
I was just looking at statewide water efficiency standards, and these are pretty much for water supply rules for private wells, okay? But as of the beginning of this year, the standard is 47 gallons per day per person, and the standard will decrease to 42 gallons per day per person in 2030, if that helps.
Commissioner West?
And again, when we're talking about per person, we're talking design standards, so that means essentially per a bedroom.
Yeah, it's usually per bedroom,
So then
Yes.
the draft motion I would make would be the recommendation to bump the water standard to 42 gallons per day per person and change the housing limit, the housing square footage to a minimum of 350 square feet or up to 400, given staff discretion for one occupant, and 150 square feet per additional occupant, up to 200 square feet at staff discretion. So they basically give them a little wiggle room to go back and ground truth those numbers before going to the board. But if we come in the middle at 350 and 150,
I would only say at staff discretion, but not less than proposed or stated in the tiny home ordinance.
Because if there's already an existing house, they could have much more than that. If they were converting an additional, an existing unit, maybe it's a 3-bedroom house already, it's 3,000 square feet, that's fine. But
yeah.
if they're proposing new construction,
Yes, these would be minimums.
Yes.
Do we want to go with that? Okay, then I will make a motion to adopt the resolution, which includes the finding of the proposed adoption of the Inland Coastal Employee Housing Ordinance as exempt from environmental review, finds that the proposed project complies with the general plan, local coastal program, and zoning ordinance, and recommends that the Board of Supervisors adopt the Inland and Coastal Employee Housing Ordinances with 2 changes. The first being changing 35 gallons of water per day per person to 42 gallons of water per day per person. And changing the second change would be changing the square footage minimums from 500 for one person to 350 or up to 400 if staff decide. And then any additional person would be 150 square feet or up to 200 if staff decide, as long as none of the numbers are less than what is currently in the tiny home ordinance.
Well done.
Well done.
I'll second
So we have a motion from Commissioner McFarland and a second from Commissioner West. Any discussion on the motion? Take a voice vote on this. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none. Motion passed. Okay. Next item is the Humboldt Regional Climate Action Plan and CEQA GHG emissions thresholds for Humboldt County. And we'll have a staff report, please.
While we're queuing this up, I'll just say that Kelsey Bennett with Rincon Associates, the EIR consultant, is also available online if there's questions.
And if I could, through the chair, Joanna Thalen is also online. If we could make her a panelist, that would be great.
Is Joanna also with Rincon? Okay.
My apologies, I have not logged into this computer since we've updated it, so it's doing some updates right now. I'm getting on it now.
Chair, I guess while we're waiting, I do have an ex parte. Maybe this would be a good time to just go ahead and do that. Okay.
Excuse me. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I just wanted to communicate and make clear that I am an employee of Humboldt Transit Authority. I'm a public agency, and HTA is a topic and part of this climate action plan. And I just wanted to present a quick history of my involvement with this RCAP process. So I've actually personally been involved in this, the development of RCAP since around 2019. But as in my current position at HTA, I've been involved in a working group that county staff put together since the start of this version of the RCAP. And I was the representative for HTA on this working group. I have attended these meetings on behalf of HTA and also drafted and brought to the board for the GM, the general manager, a statement of support of the RCAP about a year and a half ago to support jurisdictions when they were bringing updates to their councils and to the board, because a number of the measures really do involve transit, the actions by transit. And I've also helped advise county staff on transit-specific items in this process. So starting around June, I intentionally stopped attending these working group meetings in order to help sort of mitigate potential bias there. And I also did notice, as recent as today, there have been emails associated with that working group, and I intentionally have not reviewed those. And also it was brought to my attention there could potentially be pressure as an employee from the agency, like for personal benefits, to sway this process some way or another. And I just want to state that certainly has not happened. If there is any sort of audit of emails or interviews of staff that reveal that there's none of that going on. And just want to assure that all of my statements tonight are my own. I also do want to say I did reach out to a number of jurisdictions over this last week, just inquiring their opinion of the proposed changes in the thresholds. So I'd had a few discussions, and I made it clear that I was talking to them as a planning commissioner. So, thanks.
Commissioner West?
I'll also, since we're doing ex parte, say again that I work for the City of Eureka. That is also an organization that will be considering this report. However, my line of work does not have anything to do with this report. I have never worked on it, and I'm not a decision maker for the City of Eureka.
Yes, Commissioner McFarland?
I guess I'll join the ex parte expose. I also work for a transportation agency. I work for Caltrans, and while we did attend a public workshop on this about a year or so ago, all comments that have been submitted have been through a different branch at Caltrans, if any were submitted. And while I do work in climate science, all of my work is on flood waters, fresh and seawater, not emissions.
Commissioner O'Neill? Is it just you and I on this
Yeah,
one? Is
I
that-
don't have any
All right.
problem.
Director Ford and Council, I just, based on the ex parte disclosures that you heard, do you have any concerns about us moving forward as a group?
No concerns.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the disclosures. Staff, looks like you're ready, so we'll turn it to you.
Yes, thank you, commissioners. I have the presentation being shared. My name is Megan Acevedo, and I will be presenting the Humboldt Regional Climate Action Plan, the CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds, and the EIR that was prepared for both. Here's a brief overview of our agenda today. We are going to continue the public workshop from August 7th, and we'll finalize that workshop by going through Table 32, which includes all the measures and actions. Then we'll do a brief overview of the Regional Climate Action Plan. We'll do an overview of the CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds and our recommendations for that. And then we'll go through the environmental impact report that was done and the impacts that were found with that analysis. So I'm gonna-
I think we have a question here, Commissioner Curriasi.
Just a process question. I'm assuming we're not doing a workshop and then ending the workshop and then opening a hearing. Is that correct?
No, this is a public hearing. We had just promised to bring back the table and go through the table. So we figured we would honor that commitment and present that as part of the initial presentation, and then quickly go through the rest of the presentation, which would be the normal part of the public hearing. If
Thank you.
that pleases the commission.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So here is table 32. This is really small. From the RCAP. Okay. So our first measure is C1, which is to establish the Regional Climate Committee. And this is a cornerstone measure, and they will be responsible for doing updates and collaborating with the RCAP partners to implement the RCAP and track that implementation. Did we want to go into detail on each action of the measures? Is that what?
Go ahead.
I would just be I think it's worth measure T3 because there was significant public comment on that, but the other ones I'm okay with.
This is just a copy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then our next measure is going to be BE1, and that's geared towards electrification of buildings. So by 2030, it is to source 90% of grid-supplied electricity from renewable and carbon-free sources. And at our last public workshop, our CEA did relay to us that they are on track of achieving 100% renewable energy by 2030. And just to show you how it's formatted, each action of each measure will show you the phase of when this will be implemented. So we have phase 1, phase 2, and then we have ongoing. It also identifies the specific RCAP partners that will be a part of implementing each action as well. Measure BE2 is to increase the development of microgrids and energy storage across the region to support RCEA's Repower Humboldt goals of enhancing grid capacity and facilitating the electrification of buildings and transportation. Measure BE3 is further disaggregated into urban and rural measures. This one is BE3 urban, to reduce existing residential building natural gas consumption by 4% by 2030 and 74% by 2045. Measure BE3 rural is to reduce existing residential fossil fuel consumption in households not connected to natural gas infrastructure by 2% by 2030. Measure BE4 is to reduce existing non-residential building natural gas consumption by 5% by 2030 and 79% by 2045.
Can
Sure, we can take questions.
I found it really helpful when you went through the item where the goal is to get to 90% renewable energy by 2035, and then you said that the consultant confirmed that we're on track. For these ones that we've just gone through, if you know that information, could you let us know? Like, are we on track to make that natural gas reduction? And that would just be helpful if you know it.
Well, so the measure that was addressing renewable energy sources, it was Redwood Energy Coast Authority that came to our last public workshop, and they relayed to us that they, even though their goals have changed slightly due to legislation changes, that they are still on track to meeting 100% renewable energy by 2030. The rest of these, I don't really have an update for, because although some jurisdictions, our CAP partners, are already doing some of these actions, we have not done an update, we haven't actually started implementing the RCAP to know how much we've achieved and if we're on target. So until we start implementing the RCAP, then we can start tracking and seeing if we are on target. So.
And then if we're not, I guess I just want to make sure that the goals we're setting are achievable so that we don't have to make big amendments and change them later. So is it, and I don't want to get too off track, but is it built in a way?
Yeah, it is built in a way that we believe that these are all feasible. That's what the substantial evidence document is to demonstrate why these are achievable goals. And then the other really important thing is the first goal that Ms. Acevedo mentioned, which was the creation of the Regional Climate Committee. So the Regional Climate Committee's, one of their responsibilities is to monitor and report on how successful these measures are. And obviously, if some measures are less effective, to look for ways to either increase the effectiveness in other areas or modify what's being done to achieve those measures. So this is not a static document. This is a living document that will continue to morph and evolve to find increasing ways of being effective.
Okay, that was really helpful. The connection to the committee, that made it full circle. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah. Commissioner O'Neill.
I'm kind of confused a little bit on, like, when you talk about rural households who rely primarily on propane and often are not economically situated to be able to add renewable power, how are we going to achieve those goals in those rural areas?
So a lot of this is going to be dependent upon finding ways to do what doesn't always appear feasible, frankly. I don't want to say that it's going to be easy. But I think that you correctly identified the path to achieving that, which is to find an alternative form of energy to address that. And it could be solar or some other renewable form of energy that does that.
Like small hydro?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's urban or rural. We're going to, these are going to depend on some sort of retrofit programs or funding like we did with low-flow toilets or energy-efficient houses and dual-pane windows and those types of things. So,
if I could follow up on
Yeah.
that a little bit, one of the things you'll notice is that the percentages were different for urban and rural.
Mhm.
This definite consideration has been given to the constraints that exist in the rural environment. So that was something that in the first iteration of the Climate Action Plan was a big concern. And so when we approached this the second time, we definitely took that into account. So
I'm just thinking of the rural families that I'm aware of are not economically in a position to do anything. I understand with new homes, you can, have certain kinds of windows and low flow this and that, but if you're trying to retrofit and reduce their consumption of propane, they're going to need grant programs to do that.
It could be grant programs, it could be incentive programs, and it may not be just changing forms of power either. It could be insulation, It could be, weatherproofing houses to reduce the amount of energy that's being consumed.
Yeah, I've done all of those things, and they're still relying on propane, so if you had I don't know what their program is now, but something like Sacramento SMUD or whatever it's called, I know for a period of time that part of their financing through the power company was solar panels. So they would put them in for you or provide them for you, and then it would be factored into their monthly bill. So the amount that, like I put solar on my house and I went from $500 a month to, less than $200 a month, so I could afford to pay a loan and still be below what I was paying before. So you would have to have those kind of creative programs within PG&E or Redwood to do that.
Coast Energy Authority, right.
Mhm.
Commissioner Curriasi has a comment.
And Commissioner O'Neill, that the payback for fuel switching from propane versus natural gas is often a lot shorter too. Propane tends to be more expensive to run.
But it's the only option you have if you're in a rural area.
Yeah, so I guess my point being, for fuel switching options, it's actually even more difficult from a financial argument for those that are tied to the natural gas infrastructure.
I've looked at every kind of possibility, because I dealt with a community that had nothing. They had no power, and then they got power. Now they probably can't afford it, but, because it keeps going up. So I'm just saying that if we're going to meet those goals for everyone, there needs to be programs in place or encouraged. And we're not getting the help from the federal government that we used to. You get tax credits and all that, and some of those have dissipated. So if the state wants to continue on the school, then they're going to have to incorporate programs. I get it for new houses. We can require solar on new houses or certain types of windows, but you got some houses out there in the rural areas that should be tore down instead of insulated, but that's another matter.
And if
Please
I could,
continue.
through the chair, feasibility studies are also a big component of a lot of these measures to identify some avenues for, future programs or future funding, et cetera. As well with BE3 Rural, it does include expansion of existing grid infrastructure. So that is part of the proposal to potentially try and expand the grid to areas where it's feasible. And as well, alternative fuels is also another option in here.
I don't see the grid going anywhere in the near future. It took me 20 years to do 30 miles with PG&E. I could have done it in 2 years, but it took me 20.
Please continue.
Okay. So now we're on measure BE4. This is countywide measure to reduce existing non-residential building natural gas consumption by 5% by 2030 and 79% by 2045. Measure BE5 is to decarbonize 95% of new residential building construction by 2027. Measure BE6 is to decarbonize 95% of new non-residential building construction by 2027.
Just to clarify, decarbonize means electrification in this case. Or does it also include biofuels?
I believe that, I'd have to look specifically in the actions, but that one does not include the use of biofuels. It is just decarbonization or electrification, correct?
No, I'm not proposing we change the number, but I find 95% to be kind of a funny number. Just given the number of houses that are actually going to be built between now and then, who gets the one that's not that's not in compliance or something? Anyway, found it kind of funny. It's a comment.
Okay, Measure BE7 is to decarbonize 30% municipal buildings and facilities by 2030. Measure BE8 is to advocate for offshore wind developers to fund transmission infrastructure and work with PG&E, the California Public Utilities Commission, and other related agencies to build electrical transmission infrastructure to supply Humboldt with energy produced by potential future offshore wind projects, which will increase regional supply and resilience. And now we are into the transportation measures. We have Measure TE1 Urban. This is to implement programs such as those identified in HCOG's Regional Transportation Plan to increase the mode share of active transportation in urbanized areas from 9% to 12% by 2030, thereby achieving a regional active transportation mode share of 8%. Measure T1 Rural is to implement programs such as those identified in HCOG's Regional Transportation Plan that increase access to safe, active transportation to increase the mode share of active transportation in rural areas from 5% to 6% by 2030, thereby achieving a regional active transportation mode share of 9%. Measure T2 Urban is to expand the public transit network in support of HCOG's Regional Transportation Plan to increase public transit mode share from 2% to 20%, public transit mode share in urbanized areas to achieve a regional 13% public transit mode share by 2030. Measure T2 Rural is to develop a robust public transit network in support of HCOG's RTP to increase public transit mode share from 1% to 10% in rural areas and achieve a regional 13% public transit mode share by 2030. Measure T3 Urban is to reduce regional VMT by increasing mixed-use development in infill priority areas and accelerate smart growth development by requiring local jurisdictions to adopt modified or new land use zoning designations to limit urban sprawl and promote high-density development within urban areas. We did receive a lot of comments on this measure for tonight's hearing, and I do have some slides prepared in the presentation to go over this in more detail. Measure T4 is to develop and implement regional mobility hubs and zero-emission vehicle car share programs to support mode shift from single occupancy vehicles. Measure T5 is to require commercial and industrial employers with 25 employees or more to develop a transportation demand management plan. Measure T6 is to decarbonize 15% of passenger vehicle miles traveled by 2030 and 100% by 2045 through increased adoption of low and zero emission vehicles and development of a regional electric vehicle charging and hydrogen fueling network. Measure T7 is to increase commercial zero-emission vehicle use and adoption to 10% by 2030 and 100% by 2045 through a regional charging network and development of hydrogen hubs. Measure T8 is to electrify or otherwise decarbonize 12% of applicable small off-road engines, off-road equipment by 2030, and 100% by 2045, and replace fossil diesel consumption with renewable diesel in 55% of applicable large diesel in alignment with Executive Order N-79-20 by 2030. Measure T9 is to establish Humboldt as a pilot program for the decarbonization of the transportation sector to help drive state and philanthropic investment throughout Humboldt. Measure T10 is to work with the state and renewable fuel industry to establish a renewable fuel network within Humboldt, thereby funding new green industry and job growth to support the decarbonization of the transportation sector. Measure T11 is to lead by example and electrify or otherwise decarbonize 50% municipal fleets by 2030 in alignment with the state's advanced clean fleet rule. And now we are on to solid waste measures. We have measure SW1 is to establish a local waste separation facility and organics management to be able to reduce waste sent to landfills by 75% by 2030. And this would also reduce greenhouse gas emissions by limiting truck trips required to ship waste out of the county and import compost from out of the county. Now we're into the wastewater measures. Measure WW1 is to expand regional opportunities for implementation of wastewater decarbonization technologies, such as anaerobic digesters to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and produce renewable fuel sources. Measure WW2 is to reduce per capita potable water consumption by 15% by 2030. And now we're into the carbon sequestration measures. Measure CS1 is to research and implement feasible carbon sequestration technology opportunities to support growth and expansion of green jobs industry within the region. Measure CS2 is to offset fossil-based emissions and increase carbon sequestration in the community by achieving SB 1383 procurement requirements by 2030. Measure CS3 is to develop a countywide natural and working lands greenhouse gas inventory baseline by 2027, and this will help better understand the existing and future greenhouse gas sequestration and help obtain resources to protect and increase natural carbon sequestration occurring in the region, as well as promote biodiverse forests and wetlands resistant to wildfire. And I should say that we did apply for a grant with the Sustainable Agricultural Lands Conservation. And we have been awarded a grant to start a study for a natural and working lands inventory. And then we've added a measure for refrigerants. So measure R1 is prepare a baseline analysis of the volume of hydrofluorocarbons released into the atmosphere and evaluate whether these releases are being adequately addressed by CARB or whether the county should supplement the work of CARB. And that is the last measure. So I will go back. Oops. That doesn't look good. Sorry about that. Okay, so we've gone through all the measures and actions, and I will continue with our PowerPoint. We'll now go through an overview of the RCAP. I know we've already talked a lot about the RCAP at the public workshop, but I just wanted to do a quick overview. So the purpose of the RCAP is to have a climate action plan to mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions in alignment with local and state goals. This will act on policy AQP9 and implementation measure AQIM3 of the general plan. which is to develop a multi-jurisdictional climate action plan and mitigate the effects of the update to the general plan in 2017. The plan was also produced to be in alignment with State Bill 32, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, as well as Assembly Bill 1279, which is to achieve 85% greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels by 2045 and carbon neutrality by 2045. The Regional Climate Action Plan also will allow CEQA streamlining for greenhouse gas emissions analysis of future projects and plans that can show consistency with the RCAP. So the RCAP was developed through an iterative process with all of the RCAP partners, and this included the 7 incorporated cities, and other regional partners were Humboldt County Association of Governments, the Humboldt Transit Authority, Redwood Coast Energy Authority, and Humboldt Waste Management Authority. This is a living document, and this will be an ongoing process to continue updating the RCAP in order to achieve the reduction goals. So the structure of the RCAP, we've developed strategies. We have 12 strategies overall, and each strategy has measures to achieve particular goals that we've set. These measures can be quantitative or supportive. And quantitative meaning that we've quantified the greenhouse gas emissions that we would achieve through the measure. And those were quantified and shown in the substantial evidence report. And measures can also be further disaggregated into urban or rural. Measures are also, more specific actions are in each measure. They follow SMART framework. So specific goals related to specific sectors. They're measurable such that progress between 2 conditions can be measured. They're achievable with available resources. They're realistic such that actions lead to achievement. And they are time-bound such that a goal is completed in relation to target year.
I have a question. Do you think these dates are realistic, given that we've had some setback in funding possibly for the next couple of years? And then it hasn't even been approved, but you're already saying within a couple of years we're going to accomplish this or that. Do you think that those are realistic dates?
I'll jump on that. I think what we're at right now is we do have a very short time frame to 2030. We're all aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so the time frames seem tight, but I think most of the people I've talked to that are within the county and other jurisdictions find this to be extremely important. And I think that there will be urgency in seeing this accomplished.
So has there been specific projects that you've drilled down to that you identify in each of these categories that that you might set as a priority, so that you're more, if some opportunity comes up, you're ready?
So that, yes and no. There obviously are dates there, but some of it has to be a little bit subjective in allowing the RCC, when they're doing this work to establish those goals, to be working with the broader community to accomplish things that are achievable at the time.
The reason I say this is I feel like you just read the last 25 years of my life, you know, projects that I worked on for 25 years, transit, you know, a lot of those things were things that tribes have already been working on, but they take a long time. And I just think that it's really ambitious. I'm not saying you shouldn't be trying for 5 years, but can you just change the dates when 5 years rolls around? You haven't done it? Or is he mandated by the state, or?
Well, we have a 40% reduction objective requirement, maybe more correctly put, for 2030. That comes out of AB 32. So we are absolutely committed to doing everything we can to achieve that.
For instance, I have a question of you, because you're transit. Transit typically has to be supported because it doesn't break even on its own financially, right? So are those, if you up, your percentage of people riding on transit, it doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna break even. You're gonna have to buy more buses and have more bus drivers, and they're still not gonna pay for the whole cost of operating that facility. So you're gonna have to rely on outside transit grants, right? Am I right?
Yeah, we're about 70 to 80% grant funded, somewhere in there. The
So if those,
Measure O-
are those federal grants or state?
both. Measure O will help substantially.
So if the federal grants go away, which they might, then could you even meet those goals? You'd be lucky to keep what you already have. So I'm not trying to be negative, although I am being negative. I'm just saying that you don't want to box yourself into something that you're going to fail.
I agree with that, but that's part of the genius of this, I think, is the RCC has the ability to look at the situation that presents itself end of 25, 26, and migrate to something that can be done right then, which I know you've done, we've all done. We see opportunities. Ms. Acevedo mentioned the SALT grant. That came up. She jumped on that within 2 weeks, got the grant. And so I really envision it's going to kind of work like that.
Yeah, I know how that works. I was just curious if those dates were mandated by the state, or if they were just something you just pulled out of the sky and hoped that you made the 5 years from now you made it, because I don't think you will.
Well, if we don't,
Then you just change the date, right?
no, there's probably going to be consequences of not being able to achieve it.
So do you have the question originally was, do you have the option of not saying 5 years? Can you say 10 years?
2030 is an important date. Okay? I'm not going to sit here and, is it possible that we won't achieve that? Yeah. Is it true that funding circumstances have changed based upon what's going on at the federal level? Absolutely. But is that a reason with an important topic like this to stop?
No, I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying, what's the consequences if you don't meet the date, and if you're too ambitious, would that hurt you? That's all I'm trying to understand. I think you should continue trying to do and accomplish all of these objectives. I'm just thinking 5 years is kind of
I think
too
what
optimistic.
the Climate Action Plan has done is to put dates in there in terms of sequencing what makes the most sense. But as Ms. Acevedo mentioned, this is an interactive document that can be reformatted and other things can be pursued where there's opportunities. And so oftentimes we need to be opportunistic and accomplish those things that can be achieved in that moment. And I think the way this document is structured, it gives us the ability to do that. It gives the RCC the ability to do that. I think that, depending on where the RCC is, if there's, a symbiosis between what one JPA does and maybe the RCC, that there is the ability to, kind of have co-benefits in accomplishing things. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay, I'm not going to beat you up over it. I'm just being realistic.
And I think what I hear the director saying is that I think it's a plan or strategy, right? So as opportunity presents, you can turn the dial up or down or on the different strategies to make as much progress as we can towards the goal. It's not a, it's not a self-imposed goal. It's a goal that was set for us to meet, and I suspect, like many of these things that are set by the state and roll down to us, and unfortunately sometimes they're set and they roll down with no funding. Maybe some funding will come in some areas of this, but typically what I've seen is failure to take action or to make an effort doesn't usually bode well for the agencies or the districts that aren't trying to comply and trying to get there. So, which would likely result in less funding for future strategies after 2030 or whatever if we weren't on board. So, back to you, Ms. Azevedo.
Thank you. So we do have some key strategy areas that are part of our climate action plan. So we're focused around increasing renewable energy, building electrification and decarbonization of existing and future buildings, vehicle miles traveled, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and increasing zero emission vehicles, organic waste diversion, and sequestration through compost, and water efficiency. Carbon sequestration is another key strategy, and we've added refrigerants in response to comments that we received previously. So here's a graph that shows the targets that have been identified through the RCAP. So our target for 2030 is to achieve local greenhouse gas emissions of 1.24 million metric tons of CO2 emissions. And that's in line with the 2030 targets for 40% reduction from 1990 levels. And that number was found by using the state level emissions change metric and accounting for regional changes such as carbon-free electricity from RCEA. The primary drivers of climate action at the state level are, sorry, that's not correct. Okay, so RCAP implementation, the key focus on leveraging the Regional Climate Committee to efficiently use limited resources to implement the RCAP. Implementation in phases with, sorry, that should say annual progress reports and inventories to track progress. And if we're off track, additional or revised actions will be developed to meet 2030 targets. In addition to the comments that we received and responded to in the staff report, we have received additional comments in response to the draft of the RCAP that's being presented for adoption tonight. We received 12 comments requesting Measure T3 to be a countywide measure to prevent urban sprawl. Our resolution to the significant amount of comments received is to make the measure countywide. Update the measure to include infill projects within urban areas or with existing transit service, and to include a definition for infill development to be in line with LCI guidance, which is building within unused and underutilized lands within existing development patterns, typically but not exclusively in urban areas. And we have added in and within a half mile of existing transit stop. So the current draft of the measure is on the left, which identifies it as an urban measure. And our proposed change is to take out the urban in the language. And it should be noted as well that this measure does not allow streamlining greenhouse gas emissions for projects that would upzone. So CEQA analysis and greenhouse gas emissions analysis would still be required for upzoning, even though that is a measure that we've included in the RCAP.
Yeah. Commissioner Kirazi, please.
Thank you. A question on the upzoning, but an upzoning process could happen first separately from a project,
Correct.
under which then future projects could, okay.
Correct.
But to be clear, that upzoning process itself requires a secret document.
Correct.
Okay.
So here are the implications of the different options that we've provided for Measure T3. So if we keep it as an urban measure, that would not allow CEQA streamlining of greenhouse gas emissions in rural areas, which would include some of our rural city partners, City of Blue Lake, Ferndale, Rio Dell, and Trinidad, as well as rural unincorporated Humboldt County. I did put a little notation here at the bottom that the CEQA checklist would need to be updated to reflect this option. And that was unfortunately not included in the staff report tonight, so my apologies for not making those changes there. But the option that we are presenting to you tonight is to make it a countywide measure, and this would allow CEQA streamlining in infill areas with transit service, and that could include some of the rural cities such as City of Trinidad, and other areas of unincorporated Humboldt that have transit service existing, such as Willow Creek or Garberville.
I have a question. I know the state can't mandate the tribes, but have the tribes been asked to be a part of this process? Because they're in some cases already doing a lot of this.
We have not had direct communications with the tribes on their participation in the plan. We have sent them several letters updating them on our progress, as well as the appropriate AB 52 consultation. But we were so far along in the process that
I guess it's more of maybe having someone from the county interview the tribes to find out what they're doing that already is accomplishing some of these goals that you could take advantage of, but you don't know because you're not communicating. Like I saw this with low-income housing also. You know, if you're not counting those units that they're putting in, it's harming the county's goals because it's already happening. Or you have someone like Blue Lake who's got a microgrid, and you know Yurok that has a transit program, and they have carpooling, and some of the things that you brought up earlier, that you could take advantage of that, but you first would have to just reach out to them. They may not want to participate to the extent that some of the cities might, but they still have accomplished goals that should be incorporated in your achievements as a county, because they're part of the county. Just a recommendation.
And I think there's still opportunity to communicate with the tribes, but as of this point in time, they are not considered a partner of the RCAP.
Okay,
So
I'm
they-
just seeing it as a missed opportunity if you don't. I get it, like if I got a letter from the county, I might ignore it, but if someone from the county said, hey, can I talk to you about some of the programs that you have that also fit within our goals, and you might find out some pretty surprising stuff. Almost everything you brought up today, they've already been working on.
Can I make a suggestion? I really value your comment, Commissioner O'Neill. I think that's a really good point because we would get a much more holistic view of what's going on. So the suggestion that I would make would be to just make that one of the tasks of the RCC, is to do that coordination. And then that's also, like you were saying, sometimes you get a letter from the county, you ignore it because it's the county.
Yeah.
But maybe from the RCC, there's a name to a face, it's a little bit smaller, and then they can really set up those one-on-ones. So if that could be a goal of the RCC, I'd support that.
Commissioner Curriasi?
On the choice of the half mile from a transit stop, that sounds like maybe you grabbed that from the definition of a major transit, or just because you were trying to form something. I'm just kind of curious the origin of the half mile.
Yeah, that did originate with my work on the VMT policy threshold. So it was more in line with what would be appropriate there. But I feel there may be flexibility on that distance, but I felt that we should identify a distance to the transit stop for projects that would qualify.
Okay, please proceed.
Thank you. The final RCAP, there were several renditions of the RCAP. We've made updates to include consideration of comments that we've received. And let's see, minor RCAP text changes between the draft that was released in August of 2024 and the final draft that is proposed to you tonight includes an added strategy, measures and actions to address refrigerants, added definition for biofuel, biodiesel, and renewable diesel. We did update Measure T3 to be urban, and we are proposing some changes tonight. We also updated Measure T3 and T4 to address Alternative 2 that was presented in the EIR. And we presented Alternative 2 because many of the jurisdictions are actually already doing what Alternative 2 proposes. So it didn't seem far-fetched for us to adopt the Sustainable Communities alternative. And we are planning to add a definition for infill, as I showed in the previous slide. And we will update Measure T3 according to your request today, depending on the options that you choose. We also included some clarification text changes between the draft and the final RCAP. However, none of the changes affected the quantifications that were calculated in the substantial evidence report, and so the quantifications still remain the same and have not changed due to any of our changes. So now I will present the greenhouse gas emissions thresholds. So along with the RCAP, Humboldt is adopting CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds in order to establish thresholds that future plans and projects within Humboldt can utilize for analyzing greenhouse gas emissions impacts in their CEQA documents. The thresholds are established to be consistent with the 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction target and will help Humboldt meet that target as new development and projects are planned within the region. Thresholds will be used to evaluate projects that are unable to show consistency with the RCAP and are unable to streamline their greenhouse gas emissions analysis, and projects that calculate their greenhouse gas emissions at a level higher than the applicable thresholds will need to apply mitigation strategies to reduce their impact to a level of less than significant. So here is a table of the initial calculations that were prepared in the greenhouse gas emissions thresholds guidance report. I know this is actually kind of small, my apologies. So these thresholds were established on a per person basis, such as per resident, per employee, or per service population, which includes both residents and employees for mixed use projects and plans. The thresholds were calculated using the accepted methodology and guidance established by the Association of Environmental Professionals. And to assist with the use of these thresholds in projects and plans in the future, the county developed the guidance report, which describes the methodology for calculating the thresholds and the process for projects and plans to calculate and quantify their greenhouse gas emissions for comparison to the thresholds in their respective CEQA documents. The thresholds are shown on this slide and include separate thresholds by project type. such as residential, commercial, and mixed use. And they have been also further disaggregated into rural versus urban. So these initial calculations were recommended to be reduced by 50% by Rincon Consultants. The argument for that recommendation is to better suit the county to achieve the longer-term 2045 targets of the RCAP. As you saw with that graph previously, our 2030 targets is, you know, a small greenhouse gas emissions reductions, while the 2045 target is pretty large to reach. So that was part of the justification for reducing the threshold, which would therefore intensify them. However, these reduced thresholds were compared to thresholds that were adopted in urban areas, and that was another justification for reducing the thresholds by 50%. But no rural community thresholds were provided for comparison in the guidance report. And due to comments that were received at the last public workshop regarding the reduction of these thresholds by 50%, we have decided to give some options to the Planning Commission for the thresholds to be adopted. So the options are, we could keep the initial calculated thresholds at 100%, which is supported by substantial evidence by using the accepted methodology from AEP. We could go with option 2, which we felt was a fair middle ground, which was to adopt the initial thresholds at 75%. And the other option is to adopt the thresholds at 100%, did I already say that? 50% reduction of the initial calculated thresholds. All of these options could be supported by substantial evidence. However, reducing the initial calculated thresholds by either 75 or by 25% or 50% would better suit the county to achieve our 2045 targets, which could help facilitate our greenhouse gas emissions reductions that we achieve with future development.
If I could just dogpile on that, one of the concerns here is that we could be approving development between now and 2030, which would then have to be further retrofitted. So the idea is to get ahead of that, require the reduction now, so that new development between now and 2030 doesn't end up having to be retrofitted in the future.
Go ahead.
Can you just, you mentioned that staff were really supportive of the 75%. Can you explain the rationale between that versus supportive of the 50?
We felt that that was a fair middle ground, which utilized Rincon's recommendation of reducing the initial calculated thresholds to help us meet our 2045 targets. However, the 50% reduction didn't have, there was not really like a solid argument or reason for 50%. And we did feel that since we will be one of the first rural counties to adopt thresholds, that it would create a precedent for other rural counties, and that we should be considering, you know, we are different than urban areas and should not be as stringent, I guess, in the thresholds that we do adopt.
So is it based on so many units to get to this bigger threshold, or is this per house?
This is per person.
Per person. So if you might not make them anyway, why not go with the highest?
So when you go to the 50% reduction, These are for projects that don't screen out. So you're doing now a GHG analysis under CEQA. And then you'd be evaluating projects based upon that and then applying mitigation to try to get it to that level. So that is a pretty abrupt change from.
So would
from the
that
current.
make new construction unaffordable?
That's part of the concern, yes.
So above doing, you know, the stuff that you're already required to do by, you know, this law, you know, solar panels you have to put on a house now, and you have to have insulation and double pane, what else would you be requiring them to do?
That would come out of the analysis and then recommendations from the consultant in terms of what would need to be done to accomplish all of that.
I have a couple questions. When Rincon looked at this, it was a while back, when they said we were going to be the first county, rural county. Are we still in that position, or have other rural counties already adopted plans now ahead of us? And if so, what precedent have they set?
Yeah, Santa Barbara was the closest to rural compared to us that we saw that have adopted thresholds. That was provided in the guidance report and shown as a justification for reducing our thresholds by 50%.
Okay.
I couldn't really find any other, I mean, a lot of them are cities or urban counties that have
Yeah.
adopted thresholds.
Okay, one might argue Santa Barbara is not rural. Okay, and then my other question or counter to Director Ford, I understand what you're saying, is that developments that might occur between now and 2030 could find themselves in a position of retrofitting to meet the 2045 goals. The other side of that is, to meet these goals, are going to need some cooperation from the development community to try to make some progress or try to achieve this. And they might need some time to figure out what it's going to take and how to do development that's going to help meet some of these targets and reduce. So setting something that, in my view, that's not quite aggressive might in the long haul work out better in giving people time to understand the new technologies, some of the new things that they might bring into construction, and allow some time for even for the construction industry to adapt to source materials, be able to do this. So I'm an advocate of starting a little slower to help bring everybody on board than to start out so hard. That's
Aid, if I could, that's why we brought this up as an issue.
Right.
And provided options, and the options obviously are representative. There's
Right.
no hard and fast rule that one of them have to be picked. If you find something that's a little bit more appropriate, that would be absolutely appropriate.
So I think that most contractors are already doing as much as they can, afford to do. And so if you said 50%, but maybe if there's an incentive, if you do more than that, I've had funding that required that you use potash in the foundation, or you had to recycle the building surplus materials, and that was over and above what they might have otherwise done. So maybe if there's an incentive, and I don't know what that would be, in the permitting process, if they did more than the 50%, because if not, how are they going to do it unless they have a grant? And, like I did a grant for a lot of this stuff in a building that I just got funded, and it was all going to be federally funded, and then they pulled the funding, as soon as the president got in office, so that those incentives went away, and it was like, well, we can't do recycled water now. We were gonna do a microgrid, we can't do that anymore. So we had to take out all of those extra things that you would wanna see to accomplish these goals because they just weren't affordable. You know, they added millions, quite a bit more to the project. So I don't want to make projects so that they're not affordable, and that's where I think you're heading, unless you say, okay, 50%, which might be what you're already doing, but if you go up higher to 75 or 100, there's some incentive for doing that. I don't know what that might be for a contractor, or if they're able to get outside funding to do that, and that would probably be rare, but.
Sorry, Commissioner Curiosity, I just wanted to clarify one thing. 100% represents no required reduction. So it's a little bit
Oh, it's
counterintuitive.
backwards?
It's
Correct.
backwards.
Okay,
Yeah, it's just the other way, but the point's the same.
yeah.
Yeah. Commissioner Curiosity.
Yeah, I would actually argue that the unincorporated Santa Barbara County example, I think, actually does have a lot of merit as a comparison to Humboldt. If you if you look at unincorporated county, it has a lot of significant amount of ag land. It has a lot of very small towns, very rural, mountainous, and remote areas. So I think we all think of Santa Barbara, the city, but the county actually is quite rural. I think it has a lot of parallels.
It's also quite wealthy,
It is.
rural.
Correct.
So it's not the same.
They don't
In
need a
that-
carpool.
Wealth here is not a condition of whether or not we approve CEQA and the thresholds here.
It's not, but it's certainly a condition of whether or not we can afford to buy a house. And conditioning our, meeting our thresholds on the backs of future development again, comes back to the cost of housing. So that's my concern. And, you know, the region-wide approach is basically what the plan is about. This is about asking future development to do more than its fair share to help us meet regional goals. And I'm just trying to figure out, I think that future development does need to do a better job than past development did. So I can support some of that, but it's just a matter of how much, how far do we push future development to help solve problems that are created by past practices in development. And so that's, and I don't want to shut off future development any more than it's, you know, have any more constraints than it already has. So that's, I'm just trying to find the right balance there.
You're already looking at costs for $500 to $1,000 a square foot if you get into commercial. And so if you say, but we want you to do more, the people aren't going to build anything.
Just keep in mind that some of this is kicking the can down the road, right? So if
It
we don't
is.
do it now, then it will be more expensive later.
It could be. I don't.
We have
I
a
don't
net
disagree.
zero target of 2045, and while doesn't have the same mandate as I understand imposed on the county, it is a state target, and I think it's probably pretty reasonable that we'll see it mandated at some point.
And I think the contractors are already doing a lot. I just know from building things, they're already meeting a lot of requirements that are state mandated through the county when they're building a commercial or residential. I don't think they're, you know, cheaping out. So if you're asking, the kinds of things you'd be asking them to do would be like recycled water. I mean, they're already using low-flow toilets, they're already, you know, those shower heads, those kind of things are already happening. So what are you asking? If you're asking them to do more than that, it's going to cost money.
Commissioner West, comment? Okay.
She had something.
Yeah.
If I could just add to this discussion, to just give you a little more context around how these thresholds were calculated. They're calculated on the greenhouse gas emissions that we could release in 2030 based on our anticipated population. So to compare us to the county of Santa Barbara, which is 3 times our population, kind of gives them an advantage in the threshold that gets calculated. So it would make sense that their threshold would be a lower number than ours because we have a very low population in Humboldt County.
But would they not have more people to emit emissions as well? I mean, the numerator would go up as well. So we just don't know the magnitude of.
We don't, yes, but I just wanted to provide context that it is compared to a county that has 3 times our population, which is incorporated into the calculation.
Yeah, the question is, with the real lack of growth that we have in Humboldt County, what contribution to meeting our greenhouse gas emission goals is going to come from a reduction in the criteria of new construction? And I say it's going to be insignificant. So why are we putting more and more pressure on future developers when in fact their contribution to our meeting this goal is negligible?
And they're already doing a lot of things already because they're mandated to do them.
Commissioner Scavdall, you are absolutely correct. The percentage of the reduction that comes out of development is relatively small in comparison to the other things that we're pursuing.
It is. So why are we telling them one more time, we're just going to throw a little bit more on your back? And I don't get that, because it's the economy of Humboldt County that's going to pay for all of the things that we're going to do in this plan. And if we don't have that economic engine, we're not going to meet the goals. So I don't know why we want to target that.
I would say I'd kind of flip that around personally and say that if we're not able to come to consensus on a negligible amount of emissions, then how are we going to get to zero? And a lot of this cost is also going on to existing buildings. So people that own existing buildings, houses, and commercial spaces will also be paying. And it's a community and it's a global problem. And I agree, it's frustrating to put more on the backs of developers. But this isn't an arbitrary.
It is an arbitrary number.
No, the challenge of climate change is not an arbitrary thing that we're imposing on them.
Can I just make a suggestion? Maybe because we haven't gone through public comment and stuff, and this is clearly a contentious issue, that maybe someone wants to weigh in with some enlightenment on thresholds. We move on with the presentation and come back to this one.
Thank you. So I think that was the cue to move on.
Thank you. We'll go to the next slide. So I will just add that after deliberation with the RCAP partners, we are recommending the adoption of thresholds at 75% from the initial calculations. Now we'll go through an overview of the environmental impact report. So the EIR, it analyzed the implementation of the RCAP and adoption of CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds. This EIR was a programmatic EIR, meaning it had a broad, comprehensive evaluation to cover many potential actions under longer range plans, such as the RCAP or RCAP facilitated projects. It screens which RCAP measures and actions could result in environmental impacts and focuses on reasonably foreseeable direct and indirect physical environmental effects that could result from implementation of the RCAP. Since no specific development projects are proposed, analysis is not parcel or project specific, and many future development and infrastructure projects will require additional project-level environmental review for approval. The EIR analyzed all potential impacts from implementing the RCAP and CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds and found potentially significant and unavoidable impacts to aesthetics, air quality, biological, agriculture, and forestry resources, cultural resources and tribal cultural resources, noise, and utilities and service systems. Aesthetics was found to have to be a significant and unavoidable impact to scenic vistas, scenic resources, and visual character and quality, even with implementation of mitigation measures, such as implementing alternative design measures, implementing visual screening, and the potential impact to light and glare was reduced to a less than significant impact with mitigation measure to implement light and glare reduction design measures. Air quality was found to be significant and unavoidable to criteria air pollutants, even with the following mitigation measures, which are to implement construction fugitive dust measures, implement diesel equipment emission standards, and potential impacts to toxic air contaminants were reduced to less than significant with the mitigation applied to conduct construction health risk assessment and implement diesel particulate matter emissions reductions. Biological resources were also found to be significant and unavoidable to special status species and wildlife movement corridors, even with the following mitigation measures: to conduct project level biological resources assessments, conduct pre-construction bird surveys and implement avoidance and minimization measures, conduct pre-construction roosting bats surveys and implement avoidance and minimization measures, develop a marine mammal monitoring plan and implement avoidance and minimization measures, incorporate wildlife corridor measures into design prior to construction, and potential impacts to sensitive natural communities and wetlands were reduced to less than significant with applying the following mitigation measures to prepare aquatic environment documentation and implement aquatic environment avoidance and minimization measures and compensate loss of aquatic environments. Significant and unavoidable impacts were found to agricultural resources, even with implementation of the following mitigation measures: avoid actively farmed lands, prepare and implement an agriculture management plan, prepare and implement a decommissioning and soil reclamation plan, and provide financial assurance to implement soil reclamation plan. Significant and unavoidable impacts were found related to historic resources, even with the following mitigation measures: prepare historic resources evaluation prior to approval for projects involving built environment resources 45 years or older, and implementation of mitigation prior to and during construction. Potential impacts to archaeological and tribal cultural resources were reduced to less than significant with the following mitigation measures: to prepare archaeological resource assessment prior to project approval and implementation of mitigation prior to and during construction, and to suspend work around tribal cultural resources identified during construction. Oops. Significant and unavoidable impacts were found related to noise levels, even with the following mitigation measures: to implement construction noise reduction measures, and prepare operational noise study and implement identified measures. Potential impacts to ground-borne vibration during construction were reduced to less than significant levels with mitigation measure to prepare and implement construction vibration control plan.
when you said land, is that terrestrial or does that include aquatic areas as well?
It could apply to both.
Okay.
Significant and unavoidable impacts were found related to utilities and service systems, even with mitigation measures that were previously described for aesthetics, biological, agriculture, and forestry resources, cultural and tribal cultural resources, and noise and vibration. And this is a summary of the significant and unavoidable environmental impacts. So we have aesthetics, which is operational impacts to scenic vistas, scenic resources within a state scenic highway, and visual character and quality from large-scale renewable energy, renewable fuel, and organic waste processing facilities. Air quality impacts include construction impacts to criteria air pollutants from temporary construction activities. Biological, agriculture, and forestry resources include construction and operational impacts to special status species, wildlife movement corridors, and agricultural resources from the loss of common habitats and diminished resource availability, and the conversion of farmland to non-agricultural use. Cultural and tribal cultural resources were found to construction impacts to historic resources from development activities. Impacts from noise and vibration were found to noise levels from construction and operational stationary and transportation noise. And impacts to utilities and service systems were found from construction impacts to water, wastewater, and electric power, from future infrastructure facilities, operational impacts to electric power, from future infrastructure facilities. The final EIR includes responses to public comments that were received on the draft EIR related primarily to CEQA streamlining versus CEQA tiering, comments on the CEQA checklist, and concerns regarding the use of biofuels as transitional fuels in the RCAP. We did update the designation of urban areas to be in line with the U.S. Census Bureau's definition. And the EIR significance, conclusions, and mitigation measures remain and do not change in response to our the changes made. It was found that even though the project has significant and unavoidable impacts, even with mitigation measures applied, that the project would result in the following benefits to the county. Economic benefits are that the RCAP may provide economic benefits such as creating jobs, saving residents money on energy costs through efficiency measures, or by fostering new technologies. As well, adoption of the RCAP would increase the county's and other local government agencies' ability to obtain funding for future projects to implement the RCAP, and could provide some important economic growth countywide. Legal requirements and policy goals. Adopting the RCAP acts on policy AQP9 and implementation measure AQIM3 of the general plan. And the RCAP is a mitigation measure for the 2017 general plan update, and adopting the RCAP is necessary to comply with state or regional mandates for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to achieve broader environmental goals. The plan might offer some social benefits, such as improved community health, enhance regional mobility, or provide for other long-term needs for the community, such as infrastructure and grid improvements. Technological benefits could include enhancing green technologies within the region, including microgrid projects in rural areas, and encourage the production and use of sustainable alternative fuels. Region-wide and statewide environmental benefits. Adopting the RCAP would have significant region-wide benefits by addressing climate change issues such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing air quality, increasing the protection and management of natural and working lands, encouraging future restoration projects, and increasing biodiversity, as well as reducing wildfire risk. As well, the plan would allow the county and other local government agencies to work towards achieving the state goals in line with SB 32, and therefore assist the state in reaching their overall goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and addressing statewide climate change. The environmentally superior alternative to the RCAP, which was the carbon sequestration alternative 3, was found to be infeasible due to increased timelines of RCAP implementation measures, and this alternative is not being recommended for adoption tonight and was found infeasible. However, the Sustainable Communities Alternative 2 is being recommended as many local jurisdictions are already working to achieve the goals under Alternative 2. So the Planning Commission is being asked to make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to adopt the resolution to certify the EIR for the RCAP and CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds, including adopting findings of fact that the final EIR has been prepared in compliance with CEQA and statements of overriding consideration, and adopt the mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and adopt the resolution to make required findings that the RCAP and CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds are consistent with applicable policies, laws, and regulations, and adopt the RCAP Alternative 2 and CEQA greenhouse gas emissions thresholds at 75% of the initial calculations. And that ends my presentation, and staff is available for questions.
We can have questions of staff now and then open public hearing. I know we probably need to take a break. Do you want to take the break now, or do we want to ask a few questions?
Why don't you allow commission questions, and then we'll take a break.
Okay. And Commissioner Kirazzi, sounds like you have some questions.
Yeah, thank you. On the, in terms of biofuel production, I think, is there a possibility for, does staff see a possibility for streamlining biofuel production facilities under this?
Biofuel production is such a complicated thing. It will require a complete, separate CEQA analysis.
And so a part of that would be looking at the toxic air pollutants and criteria.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And I just triple confirming that this EIR does not include carbon sequestration, or does not, the EIR does not cover carbon sequestration. Well, actually, now that I say that, you do have planting trees, so in that sense it does, but not in the land's inventory.
That hasn't been fully evaluated, because part of the direction of the RCAP is to pursue that for the 2045 and the 2030 update, if you will. So that will be wrapped into that. The work that we're starting to do now will start to inform that. And so that will be more thoroughly evaluated in the 2030 update.
Okay, thank you. A couple more on the noise mitigation measure. You call out wind turbines, and but you don't call out other industrial activities, and yet you talk about biofuel production facilities or hydrogen production. And I was a little bit curious why just wind type turbines were specifically called out.
I think part of it is that when you're starting to envision what may happen based upon the encouragement of the RCAP, you start to look at those specific uses. In Humboldt County's example, we have seen turbines be applied for before. Whether they're likely to come back or not, I can't answer that.
Yeah, I guess, does it, it reads to me like it would only apply to the two examples. The two examples are wind turbines and transit projects. But, so are you saying those are intended to just be examples of the types of projects that it could be applied?
I don't think it's intended to be exclusive of other things. It'd still need to comply with the performance standards of the mitigation measures.
If you wanted to make a suggestion later to change the verbiage to say all industrial activity, for example, I'd be supportive.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner O'Neill.
Did they look at local production of items rather than trucking items in, say, food production as a way to reduce greenhouse gases? Like, every time we approve a cannabis, I think someday it's going to be a food producer, you know, because the price of food is probably going to go up to the point where we'll make more money than their cannabis. But that way you don't have to bring as much in. And so if you analyze the types of items we use locally and whether or not, because at one time Humboldt County produced pretty much everything they needed locally. Is that an option?
Could be.
That was not included as a measure in the current draft of the RCAP, but it could be added at a later point in time to an update to the RCAP.
Okay.
Okay. Why don't we come back at 8:15? We'll take a break. We're going to open the public hearing on the Climate Action Plan. And I see a couple of people online with their hands up. Please remain patient. I'll take those in the room first. And you'll each have 3 minutes. Please approach the podium.
Good evening. My name is Colin Fisk with CRTP. CRTP has more than 850 members and supporters throughout the county and beyond, and we've been strong advocates for regional climate action plans since the general plan was adopted in 2017, calling for it. Actually, I remember meeting with Director Ford in February of 2018. I looked at my calendar, it's almost 8 years ago now, to talk about plans for the RCAP and advocate for quick development and adoption of a robust plan. So much for quick, I guess, but here we are. And I guess, you know, just as you all know, I think, from reading the comments that we've made and our public statements, CRTP and our allies continue to have a lot of concerns and disagreements with the plan. But we are encouraged by the staff recommendation to adopt Alternative 2, which we support and which will make the plan more robust. And frankly, it's just far past time that we adopt something so we can move on to developing the Regional Climate Committee, hiring climate action staff, basically building the critical infrastructure for climate action. As you have been discussing, we only have a few short years to act on the plan before we have to develop another one for adoption in 2030. I also want to express gratitude to staff for addressing the public comments around Measure T3. One quick item there, I would encourage adoption of the state's standard infill definition, since that is a well-established regulatory definition. And if you do modify it with the transit stop element, that there should be some kind of qualifications on the transit stop issue in terms of a designated major transit stop or having a minimum frequency of half an hour or some sort of a thing, so that we're not talking about stops that are serviced once or twice a day that have no meaningful impact on VMT. I also want to briefly address the GHG emissions thresholds. So The EIR analyzed the emissions thresholds that were recommended by Rincon, and I think it's important to note that, Rincon stated in their justification for that 50% figure that essentially the technologies and techniques to achieve that are already available, and if many of them are standard. So if we adopted a higher threshold, we'd be leaving emissions on the table essentially. Also, changing and increasing that threshold, which was analyzed in the EIR, would require the county to amend the EIR because it would increase impacts of the project. So let's just not go down that road. In short, we ask you to make that minor tweak to T3 and recommend adoption of alternative 2 as recommended by staff and the original emissions thresholds recommended by Rincon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Matt Simmons. I'm an attorney with the Environmental Protection Information Center, better known as EPIC. So ditto everything Colin said, but I want to drill in on the CEQA GHG thresholds. So what is a threshold under CEQA? It's all of you making a recommendation about when an impact becomes environmentally significant, right? You're setting that threshold and you say, if you cross this, it's environmentally significant. On the dais just now, this turned into a conversation about cost, and that's just not a relevant factor for environmental significance. Now, CEQA does have an outlet for when cost is an overriding consideration. You move on and you say, okay, we couldn't get to this threshold, using all of our existing technologies. However, we still believe that this project is worth the effort, and so we're going to submit a statement of overriding considerations. And so that would be the appropriate time to bring cost into a factor. Here, when we're just setting the thresholds, it really shouldn't be considered. Furthermore, I want to repeat what Colin said, which is that the EIR analyzed the recommendation that Rincon made, which is being talked about as 50% now, but was really the recommendation. None of the alternatives analyzed 75% or 100%. And so you'd be increasing the impacts of this project now at the last minute without having considered them in the EIR, which I would recommend against doing. Finally, I know that it was comparing it to Santa Barbara, and we had that whole conversation. Rincon stated that they chose the 50% reduction because they were trying to match it to what was technologically feasible today, not necessarily what was based on other similar counties, but what was based on current available development practices. And I think that if development is adopting the other items in the RCAP, that'll be reducing GHGs sort of innately, right? And so we should have fewer and fewer projects actually hitting the GHG threshold. And so it doesn't make sense to set it higher now, right? And then finally, I do want to emphasize the 2045. Everything that we do in the next 5 years, it's just pushing the can down the road for the next 15 years. And whenever you look at the graph of how we're going to reduce emissions, it already sort of jerks up slightly at 2030 when we theoretically increase all of these things. And I don't think we need to be doing that any more than we already are by changing the threshold to this 75% number. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Angie Dodd. I wanted to add to the written comments submitted on behalf of Praj White and myself. Humboldt County is basically the first small rural county to adopt a cap and emissions threshold. To date, the county's cap strategy has followed the same strategies and analyses as done for densely populated areas across the state. Across the state. This does not make sense for Humboldt. There is nothing in the state regulations, air board documents, or CEQA guidelines that mandate the county to adopt the same emission targets as the state. Due to the county's abundance of natural forest land and the very low contribution to overall emissions, the county could make an argument based on substantial evidence that the county's target is less than 85% of anthropogenic inputs to meet the 2045 neutrality and still assist with the state's overall goals. Limiting Humboldt so that only 15% of emission reductions can come from carbon removal or sequestration is foolish. What does that mean for Humboldt? Of the 1990 estimate of 2.1 million metric tons of carbon input, only 310,000 metric tons can come from carbon sequestration. This would require conserving 2,800 acres of forest land in the county. Excluding state and federal lands, this represents only 0.2% of the forested acres in the county. Again, nowhere is it mandated that the county must only use carbon sequestration for up to 15% of emission reductions. I suggest you allow the policy to increase the percentage to an appropriate number. Why are we giving it away? I also have a comment regarding the CEQA thresholds. No other jurisdiction in the state has reduced their calculated geographic specific thresholds, not even Santa Barbara. There is no substantial evidence to justify reducing Humboldt's thresholds by any amount. For example, the 2030 new residential threshold, as written, is a 68% reduction per new resident over the next 5 years. Reducing the threshold by an additional 50% would result in an 84% reduction per new resident. This is a reduction of 11.2 per capita metric tons from the 2022 amount to 1.8 per capita by 2030, and that's per new resident. To believe we can reduce per capita emissions by this amount is unattainable due to Humboldt's rural nature, lack of feasible electrification, and feasible transit opportunities. It makes more sense to increase the per capita thresholds and mitigate the rest with sequestration. I urge you to be careful of unintended consequences. We already have limited development, and our land use and zoning are already restrictive. Upzoning in RCAP appropriate areas may end up being impossible or too prohibitive with arbitrary lowered thresholds. So please consider my comments when making recommendations to the Board of Supervisors. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you.
All right. Good evening, commissioners, and through the commission staff. Thank you for putting your service into the community, and staff for the hard work. I recognize after reviewing all of the documents how hard our county staff worked on putting this forward. I wanted to touch base that the recommendation for the thresholds of significance for the new resident to be set so low is unnecessary, unjustified, and likely unattainable. We could use our natural resources and help set our carbon sequestering target at a higher level than 15%. I want to make a comment that potentially the RCC would have the ability, once the technology and the studies come in, of how can we do the carbon sequestering, and just want to make sure that the RCC would have that ability to adjust that 15% if the studies that come forward make sense. You know, I think it's a really big deal because what we're talking about is projects that don't fit within the CEQA streamlining checklist. And the ones that don't screen out are the ones that are going to have to use those thresholds and move forward. And it may be basically setting us up for a moratorium for any project that doesn't meet that streamlining act. And I think it is a little bit of the chicken and the egg, because as I had been involved in cannabis projects coming forward, one of the benefits was the cannabis operators were willing to give up generators and go on renewable energy and be the first to pay into RCEA and help bring those 100% carbon neutral power to our county. And I think that if we're not able to create some new projects to start that moving, that power will not become available to the rest of the residents, and we won't be able to change. I think it's significant. I was looking at a project that the renewable energy from that program can cost as much as 10 to 13 times more than conventional power. And so if we think we can do this without building new projects, we're going to miss the target, because we won't be able to get that green power. We won't be able to make it available to the regular resident that is in the county. So I think it's a really big deal. When it comes to my other comment is that there are projects in the area, in the community. I'm concerned that a project that needs a general plan amendment or a rezone to be able to meet the CEQA checklist, I think it's important to recognize there are many properties like in McKinleyville that may be zoned RS20, and maybe we want to move them to R4 or R1, and they are located right in a zone that meets all the requirements of this infill development, yet the land use change makes it so that we have to use those very tiny thresholds of significance to prove the project will work. And then you won't get a project and then you won't get housing. And, you know, our new RENA numbers are 2,600 units in the unincorporated county. And how can we expect to do that when we'll restrict people from being able to develop on reasonably located lands? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello again, my name's Joanne McGarry, and I wore this hat once to a Board of Soups meeting to say I'm the Mad Hatter because the White Rabbit says I'm late, I'm late, I'm late. And as Colin described the length of time it has taken that I have been involved in participating in this regional climate action plan, just as a concerned citizen and not very educated on a lot of this terminology. I just want to say I bring this up, and I'm so anxious for this to get implemented and activated, and Humboldt County get on the map as announcing that we not only have a plan, but we are adopting what I would hope would be an ethic. As a couple of people have mentioned here on the dais, there's an urgency on this issue. This is not a casual thing that we're talking about. And, you know, greenhouse gas emissions is ultimately what we're talking about, and reducing them. And, you know, I've spoken up at Arcata City Council meetings, and I to even go to RCAA meetings and things like that about all of us, our individual responsibility, our community responsibility to doing what we need to do, sacrificing sometimes so that we avoid suffering in the future. And so I think in all this bureaucratic kind of terminology, we really need to step back a little bit individually, think about what we're talking about, and really think about what we can do to move forward and make it a workable and much healthier living for us in Humboldt County, with all the challenges that this plan will represent. But I moved here from Santa Barbara, so it's kind of interesting to hear. And I worked in a rural part on the Gaviota coast of Santa Barbara, and it is a very expansive rural area. And yes, there are some rich people there, but there's some rich people here too. But it is different, but it's the same. But all I want to say is, let's step back and know that this is so important. Let's do it now, and adapt as we can, but an adaptation for the future is what we're going to need to do, and a plan and how to do it is what is really, really important. So I just appreciate all the work that's gone into it, and I just want to say, let us, you know, take the bus more, let us waste less, and let us conserve energy. Conserve. We can switch to alternatives, but let's individually think about what we're doing and do less sometimes, and that's doing more. So thank you.
Thank you. See, we have a couple of callers online, and 3379, you've had your hand up for a while. *6 to unmute. And you're unmuted.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Melody Meyer, and I'm an environmental attorney and a co-director with the Redwood Coalition for Climate and Environmental Responsibility. I'm commenting on the proposed change to the greenhouse gas significance threshold. The staff recommendation to increase the GHG threshold by roughly 50% from what was evaluated in the EIR would constitute a material change to the CEQA project. CEQA does not allow agencies to weaken a significant threshold after circulation and then assume that the environmental consequences are unchanged. By definition, raising the threshold makes it easier for future projects to avoid a significant finding, which increases the project's environmental impacts relative to what the EIR disclosed. Under the CEQA guidelines, significant thresholds must be supported by substantial evidence and adopted through a transparent public process. More importantly, when an agency proposes changes that would result in new significant impacts or a substantial increase in the severity of previously identified impacts, recirculation or subsequent environmental review is required. The EIR analyzed the RINCON methodology and 50% of the threshold recommendation, and it didn't analyze a higher threshold. So increasing it now alters the project description and increases GHG impacts compared to what the public has already reviewed. If the county believes that the ARR's threshold is unreasonable, CEQA requires evidence and analysis and not a last-minute change. And so you would need to show with substantial evidence how a higher threshold is consistent with state climate targets and will not worsen impacts. And that analysis hasn't been done or circulated. And so I support the original recommendation of the 50% of the threshold as recommended by RINCON. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next caller is 5434. *6 to unmute. And you're unmuted.
Thank you so much. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Gary Hughes. I'm actually a property owner in southern Humboldt, and I work as the Americas Program Coordinator with the international organization Biofuel Watch. I heard staff say earlier that this has been something of an iterative process, and I would concur. I think I first really got involved with the process around the Climate Action Plan in 2021, certainly by the spring of 2022. So it's been some years, and frankly, some of the earlier versions of the plan had really serious falsehoods in them and some very erroneous information about climate policy in California. Things have improved, and we had written a number of letters and engaged quite a bit trying to raise concerns about the pivot to liquid biofuels, and in particular the so-called renewable diesel as it's elevated in the climate plan. And fortunately, yes, it appears that some really important corrections have been made, definitions have been tightened up. We continue to have real concerns about the central role of renewable diesel in this climate plan. And those concerns are actually articulated by staff in the response to questions. This is not something that I wrote, this is what staff wrote, that the concern with renewable diesel is that it is primarily made from food crops like soybean and canola oil. Crop-based biofuels compete with food production and increase land use impacts, including deforestation, that may not be accurately captured by the state of California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program's carbon intensity scores. I add on to that which staff said to say that the LCFS also has grossly underestimated the refining emissions that come from making renewable diesel. It takes phenomenal amounts of hydrogen, is all procured from fossil gas, so the greenhouse gas emissions from making renewable diesel are actually higher than if you just make diesel from petroleum. And so most of the science now shows that renewable diesel is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than just using fuel from petroleum. So there is still quite a bit of work to be done if it is indeed that this climate action plan is meant to be a roadmap for Humboldt County to actually respond to the climate crisis. Along those lines, I also want to kind of refute some of the magical thinking, both from staff and other people who have engaged in this process about the sequestration potential in the land sector. And as we've seen, and the science is showing that as temperatures rise and the landscape gets drier, that the carbon sequestration possibilities.
Your 3 minutes is
like
up.
course, are being.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for your patience. I couldn't see the clock by calling in by phone. Thank you for your attention to my comments.
Thank you very much. Okay, I don't see any other hands online or any other speakers in the room, so I'm going to close the public hearing, and I'm going to bring it back to staff, if you will. if there's anything that we heard from public commenters that you would like to address, Director Ford.
Yes, I'd first like to introduce Kelsey Bennett and Joanna Thalen to discuss a little bit about how the EIR treated the GHG threshold, sorry.
Okay, are they?
They are in, there's
can you hear
Kelsey.
There we are.
Hi. Well, yes, we worked on the EIR as well as the CEQA threshold guidance. And to the question about how it was addressed in the EIR, basically for thresholds, they're basically guidance documents or policy documents that in and of themselves are administrative approvals and significance thresholds for you as a CEQA lead agency to adopt. And in and of themselves, they don't propose new development or any changes to land use designations or zonings. So we concluded that the implementation of the thresholds themselves, the use of them by staff and the county and the cities, would not result in direct construction or operational impacts, the way some of the potential RCAP measures and actions could result in potential physical environmental impacts. So I just wanted to share that information.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'd just also like to say that one of the things that we were struggling with was in item T3. While that does talk about development and the overall goal, it very much talks about development in relationship to transit service and starting to concentrate development near transit stops. And so that is why when we put in the definition or propose the definition for infill development, it uses the LCI definition, but it adds in the fact that it should be in proximity to transit. Because when you read the actions all talk about that symbiotic relationship between transit and increased intensity of development.
Just a follow on that, because one of the commenters talked about the different types of transit hubs that we might have in the county, and that we should try to get the infill development around, you know, broader transit hubs, if you will, that have more service. I don't know, you know, how that impacts us in some of the rural communities. Maybe they just don't have yet that high of a level of service, but we would still want to encourage development to be within those communities that have transit service and utilities and that type of infrastructure, would we not?
Yes, and that was when I first read the rewrite of that. It seemed like, okay, this is a bright, clear line in identifying that this is for urban areas, because in the urban areas is largely where you find the transit services. And if you really want to reduce vehicle miles traveled associated with new development, making new development, having transit services a component of that makes a lot of sense. Because if you put them closer together, people are far more likely to use the convenience of the transit service. But if they have to walk or bike or drive to a transit service and then park and ride, they're far less likely. So that's why originally it was intended or written to be an urban measure. And then, frankly, rural areas wouldn't pass that.
Right.
And so we were trying to get around that a little bit. But realistically, what are we trying to do? We are trying to put development around existing transit. And I don't think the comment about having defining the lead time that's appropriate, and I frankly don't know what that
Yeah.
appropriate number would be. But I think that's probably a helpful threshold, because a bus that goes by once a day probably really doesn't serve the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. And I frankly, the three of us have pulled our hairs out about this for the last 2 days, trying to figure out what's this trying to accomplish. Fundamentally, it's trying to change the way land use is done and do it in a coordinated way that centers on transit services. And so I would just offer that as something that we're truly struggling with and have struggled with. We're trying to keep it simple at the same time that people can understand it. And that's why using the LCI definition, which says it's typically but not exclusively in an urban area, gives a little bit more flexibility for certain areas.
Yeah.
But it's still got to be in context of transit.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what the future is going to bring.
Right.
Through the life of this plan, and just saying that we can only have development where, we have significant public transit now, which is essentially saying, well, we'll develop in Eureka and Arcata, and ignore whatever might happen in the South County. And we don't know what the future economic engine or what's going to happen there. And they do have transit service.
Correct.
But granted, it's a long haul. And but would the plan, as we have it written now, be able to accommodate that?
The way the revision that we're proposing today does, yes.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that we kind of thought, wow, this is kind of good, because it is adaptive.
Yeah.
And HTA can do things that may change the circumstances. Some communities, cities, may not have bus service right now, but they may get bus service. And so that changes the equation. The other thing I kind of wanted to respond to is that it's really important that we not confuse the fact that it's not just carbon neutrality that AB 1279 demands. There are two components there. One is an 85% reduction in GHG. And then the 15% can be done through carbon sequestration or other technology to absorb carbon. Those aren't numbers that we came up with. That's what the state is giving us to deal with. And so that's, I think, a really important thing to deal with and understand. I know there's disagreement on the biofuels. As Mr. Hughes mentioned, we are working towards attempting to have a better, fuller understanding of that. And the RCAP doesn't treat biofuels as the end-all, be-all solution. It's an interim measure to try to get folks to move away from diesel. I know that there's concern about the use of biofuel, and some of it I get, but that is something the state has also indicated that they would like to see. And so we've been researching that and looking at, okay, where's the state land on this? And I know there's lots of opposition to what the state has done. But we're trying to walk that line.
You have a question? Yeah.
Two other questions that came up. I was hoping Director Ford or staff could answer. One was the statement that the land use change means that they would have to use the new thresholds, and so this would therefore prevent infill?
No, that was a little bit more of a nuance. Thank you for bringing that one up. So one of the discussions that has gone on for a while is in the CEQA checklist, it clearly identifies that a project has to be consistent with the land use and zoning to qualify for the screening. And the argument is that, well, if it meets all the other criteria, why doesn't it just screen out? And in researching that and working with Rincon, our understanding, the guidance we got, is that in cases where climate action plans have been overturned and screening tools have been overturned for projects, is because there was a fundamental problem. They used a screening tool that was for a project that was not consistent with land use and zoning. And even though it sounds really great to increase density within an urban area or an infill area, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to not have GHG emissions beyond a certain threshold, and so you still need to evaluate that.
Okay, that's helpful. And then the last one was there were some claims made that changing the thresholds would require EIR amendment and therefore a recirculation.
Well, I think what I just heard Kelsey Bennett say, and if I said this wrong, Kelsey, please raise your hand or speak up, but is that the thresholds were guidance documents for use by the Planning Commission, by the staff, by the cities, and that the EIR conclusion was that because they didn't really permit anything, they didn't have an impact.
Well, she said, she didn't use the word permit, she said result in construction, like directly result in construction. So that's where I was getting tripped up between, because it like, yeah, kind of does, but kind of doesn't. That's where I just wanted to clarify. But if the county is fine, then that's fine.
Please do, Kelsey.
I can add on to what John said. So what would trigger a need to do another round of CEQA on the thresholds themselves would be when you go to change them, well, to do new ones that would take you beyond 2030. Because right now, these thresholds only reflect the through 2030 targets and measures quantification, if you will. So the next time you would need to do CEQA is because you'd have to do thresholds that are for beyond 2030.
Okay, that's helpful. And then the last question was, we had he's gone. Anyway, someone commented that the use of a CEQA statement of overriding consideration would negate some of the price debate that we've had. So basically, if there's a CEQA statement of overriding consideration saying it's too costly to do this.
I didn't understand that to be the argument. I understood that price doesn't come into a consideration when establishing a threshold. And so the thing that only happens when you have a mitigation measure and you determine that a mitigation measure in an EIR is so costly that it's infeasible.
Okay.
Okay. So I think the argument there is that what is trying to be done is establishing basically an administrative guideline, administrative threshold for analysis that will guide the level of significance threshold.
Okay. I think I must have misunderstood the lawyer's comment. That's all my notes.
Yes, Commissioner West.
To circle back to T3 and the definition of infill, I think I'm wrapping my head around the conversation, so I'm sorry if you've already said this. So I heard the commenters say that they were encouraging us to go with the state standard definition of infill, which is different than what staff has proposed, correct?
What staff is proposing is the use of the state definition of infill and adding the transit component to it.
And then the
So basically what they would do is remove the transit component, which would open up huge other areas of the county for development and streamlining, not having to do GHG emission analysis, when the purpose of that measure is to concentrate development around transit.
And then the discussion was how do you further define what is a transit stop? And I heard
Right.
staff say that they were, am I correct in interpreting that you were amenable to like considering defining that a little bit differently than how it's currently written, or?
We are. We used the, I think the half mile, because that's typically what's used in relationship to I think what the term is, high-quality transit stop. But, you know, having a definition of frequency, in addition to that, I think is appropriate, because the frequency would give an indication of whether or not it's really a viable transit system for people who are going to and from work, doing their own trips and things like that. If it only comes by once a day, probably it doesn't really help.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that and repeating some of what you said earlier. That's helpful.
Again, sorry to pile on, but just to be clear, because there are transit stops that aren't in areas that would meet the definition for infill development, and those obviously wouldn't. So it has to be infill development with nearby transit. I would just say, there's a transit stop in Fernbridge, right? Doesn't qualify for infill development just because of the fact
right.
it has a transit stop there, right?
Right, because there's not development around it.
Correct.
Yep.
Right, okay. Yeah, Commissioner Curiosity.
To build off of that, just to reiterate, so you're saying that because you're saying you're using the LCI definition of infill.
Yep.
And then you just said you're using the state definition, so you're using those as analogous?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay, just wanted to clarify.
Yep.
I don't know if this makes any sense, but speaking up for the rural areas, back to what I said earlier, sometimes you take the services to the people, and then they don't have to have 50 people driving a week from Hoopa and downriver, say, for medical. And I had to calculate, if I built a rehab facility in that rural community, how many people would not drive out to town every day, and found out that at least 50 people a week were coming out here for services. So by building closer to where people lived, we didn't need transit, and we were reducing greenhouse gases because we weren't driving 50 people by themselves out to town, which they didn't have the money to do anyway. But we also looked at bringing elders out here with smaller vehicles that didn't require, commercial driver's licenses, vans, what have you, to bring them out here a couple times. That prevented people from having to drive. So you're not leaving them out of the equation or saying, well, we can't do anything in rural areas because they don't have this high-quality transportation, which they're never going to have. And maybe we won't even have it here if there's no federal funding to support it. So looking at alternatives to take services, either mobile services, medical services, because those are the primary things in the rural areas are coming to town for. They're coming to shop and to get medical. Other than that, they probably could care less unless they have a job that they have to leave the area. And we, working with the tribe, we had vans, and we had 3 or 4 vans that left this area and went up there rather than everybody driving their own vehicles. So there are ways to bring the rural communities into this plan and not just totally ice them out and say, well, you don't have high quality transit, so we're not going to build in your area. I think we need to remember that we don't need everybody in Arcata and Eureka.
Could we add to the definition that it includes formalized rideshare programs?
I think you could put in there whatever makes sense. I don't feel like I'm the person to word what should be in there. I'm just wanting to bring up that there are people in rural areas and people who want to live in rural areas, already live in rural areas. And, I looked at, like I said, this project I just did, it was $14 million more to incorporate, even though people say, well, we don't want to look at cost. It was going to be $14 million more to build this project if I incorporated all of these extra things like, we're talking about that are over and above your normal building standards, recycled water, all of those extra microgrids and things that make the project do all of the, and I had to do all the calculations to see how much we could reduce, emissions and all that. But it was $14 million more. And we had to eliminate some of those when that funding was no longer available. They just pulled it all away, you know, and just sent us an email, said, don't expect to get funded because the money's going away. So cost does matter, but building services or providing services in those rural areas, providing local food sources, all of those kind of things go a long way to keeping people all from having to drive into town.
I absolutely understand what you're saying, and that could be something that gets explored later.
Right, and I just want to bring it up because I want to speak for the community that I worked for, and I know Southern Humboldt probably has the same issues.
Absolutely, and that's why if you look at the measures, are rural measures that recognize the very kinds of limitations that you're talking about. That's why there's different measures for transit even in terms of providing transit service to rural areas. It's just not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
The question that we're struggling with right now, though, is where do you want to encourage intense development? That's the question.
It seems like you've already decided that. I mean.
Well, we are certainly recommending that it goes in urban areas or infill areas that are adjacent to transit. From a planning standpoint, that makes the most sense.
So far, it's been McKinleyville.
Well, McKinleyville is with the town center. That would certainly be an example of how this would work. But this would also be within the county in areas like Hutton and Myrtletown. It could conceivably be, and I don't know what the lead time is, down to Garberville and Redway or up to Willow Creek. But, you know, depending on what the lead time is, if that's something the Planning Commission chooses to add in, those could be options too.
It gets real expensive in the rural areas when there's not power, there's not water. You got to build all the infrastructure when you build housing. Because it's not there, so it
well, I
gets
understand,
expensive.
but those are separate issues.
Right.
We're trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled in new development.
Well,
and-
I'm talking about vehicle traveled right now that is happening because those services aren't by them, and so they have to come out here.
Understand that, but you mentioned earlier how expensive it is to get bus service extended.
Oh, yeah. But you don't need a giant bus, maybe you need a smaller vehicle to transport.
And if you look at T2 Rural, you will see all those things are things that it's asking the RCC to look at.
Okay. I'm not preaching, I'm just want to make sure that people who haven't lived in those areas understand their concerns and their issues too.
And this doesn't prevent people from developing in those areas. It just means that they're not streamlined, that just the GHG quantification portion of their project is not streamlined under this. That's all it does. That's the only difference.
Right, and it doesn't prohibit transportation services to be developed to support whatever that development is in the future should it happen.
That's what
Right.
I'm talking about.
No. So, you know, if and when the hospital gets built in Garberville and if other stuff develops around that, you know, I could imagine, you know, some sort of micro transportation grid or something to help support that community and, you know, for transportation to and from the medical services or whatever it might be. But, yeah, that's not exactly what this is about right now. Okay?
I have
Commissioner Kirazi.
I have a couple of thoughts in the resolution itself. So in the resolution for the EIR, yes. On finding 5G, so 5G is basically stating that this project does not have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. I would like to qualify that saying through 2030, because I would say that if we can, that we'll have to increase our efforts once we hit 2030 in order to hit the 2045 target. So I would just, if that's an option to add.
That's absolutely fine.
Thank you. On the noise mitigation, I feel like the specific call out of doing a noise impact analysis on new transit service conflicts with the existing CEQA exemption for expanding or establishing new transit service, and that is now permanent exemption through SB 71. So ask staff to look into that.
Sure.
Just to follow on, isn't new or future transit service, is it going to be electric, or is it hydrogen, or?
Yeah, what was called out in the EIR was to do a part of the noise analysis was a vibration study. So the larger vehicles rolling through existing right-of-ways. And current CEQA exempts expansion or establishment of new transit service on existing public right-of-ways. It is qualified. It has to be operated by a public agency, so private agencies don't get that exemption. So staff might need to look into that, but it reads to me like it conflicts with existing.
We'll check that out. Thank you.
Let's see. I think I had one more on the resolution for the thresholds. So it's the second resolution. Under finding 3, evidence E, at the end of evidence, the second paragraph of evidence E makes it sound like it makes it sound like the information in the RCAP doesn't necessarily need to be updated in 2030. I think just rephrase that where if we're not meeting our 2030 targets, then we will be taking that into consideration during the update.
Oh, yeah.
It reads differently.
Okay.
So just reviewing how it reads, it read differently to me. And I know that's not the intent.
Thank you.
So those were my comments on the specific resolution language. On T3, I've really appreciated the discussion we've been having. I think in general, I do support staff's proposal. I would not support starting to come up with our own definition of what a effective transit stop or effective transit service is. I would leave it to, for example, the definition of a major transit stop or a high quality transit stop, these definitions that have already been defined and used, and or approach other jurisdictions or agencies or HTA for a definition. Yeah.
A question for you?
Yep.
So HCOG developed the list of high-quality transit stops, and that's very limited.
Yep.
Do we want it to be that limited?
So transit requires density to get a high level of use, and it requires frequency to get a high level of use. And so one, you do best serving areas where there's higher density. That's just where you're going to get more people to use it, and that's going to be your transits. That route will do better, just from a cost perspective and all sorts of measures. Frequency is required in order to get people to use it. If they have to wait around for half an hour, or 2 hours, you just don't get a significant use. To get frequency, you have to have money. you have to have more buses, you have to have more drivers. So,
And you have to have the it's a little bit of a chicken and egg analysis argument. So we only have 2 high-density, high-quality transit hubs?
There's about 5 in the entire county.
Okay.
yeah,
So,
and that's because of the frequency constraint. We just
right,
don't
so,
have the
so there's
frequency.
one at Bayshore Mall. But if you say that you can only have housing within half a mile of that transit hub, there's not very much space that you're going to end up, unless the mall itself becomes housing, which maybe it could. So that's the challenge that you're describing, right? So you have to have density
And frequency.
and frequency, yeah. So
So-
are we the question is, are we putting too much constraint?
Well, I would offer for thought that part of what we're trying to do with T3 is to build up that density so that there's more opportunity to ride the bus from other locations than those that are already high-quality bus stops.
Yeah, I would, in other countries, that's a typical approach taken where you lay the framework of your transit infrastructure, just like you lay water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure, and then that's what you build around. We just historically haven't done it that way here.
Doesn't it count if you have employment or shopping or medical or school? I mean, obviously the schools are probably a big user of your transit, so it's not just housing.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
So because we haven't done it that way before, does that mean we shouldn't try something different?
No, that's not what I was trying to say. No, I think trying something different, we definitely encourage. I'm a little nervous about defining what will create success in this group.
I know what we're trying to do, maybe this will help you think. It's taken me a while to get here, is to create some boundaries around this thing where we're not just opening up the whole county willy-nilly to get, a pass. And really trying to target what we're trying to do, which is what I just heard you say, which is to have HTA work with HCOG, work with the county, work with the cities to identify target areas where we're going to try to improve that transit system there by increasing that density. That's what T3A or whatever it is.
Yeah, and actually, that effort is currently funded through HCOG. It'll be kicking off here within the next month. Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was the suggestion of using the state definition of infill, which you're saying we are using that.
We're just adding to it.
And you're adding to it because that particular measure is focused on transit.
Correct.
And so are you suggesting that the half-mile distance is a prerequisite, but it's up to county or jurisdictions to put in that half-mile stop first? And we have to work with the agencies and figuring out the funding to do that first before you can streamline.
Yeah, so, yes, I think when this is operational, there will be areas identified, there will be ordinances that basically allow ministerial approval of projects in targeted areas. That's where this is going to. So in the meantime, it's going to be a little bit awkward if somebody comes in and tries to do something. If it's in the county, we're going to be calling HTA and we're going to be having conversations about whether or not this is a good idea and whether or not it's a yes or no.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think I'm definitely, I think I could support the half mile. In that context, with that intent, I think supporting a half mile without the frequency portion of it, which comes from the high quality stop definition, I think there's potential there. Yeah.
So just to play that scenario out, so if a developer came in and wanted to put in a high-density infill housing complex, and it wasn't within a half mile, but they said, oh, well, we'll put in a transit stop. So there's a transit stop, but they'd have to coordinate with the transit agency to see if any buses would actually get to that transit stop and how frequently. But those kinds of things would be conceivable by parties working together. If it didn't make sense for a transit stop there, even though a developer said, oh, I'll put a transit stop in, well, some places won't make sense, right? The
Right.
bus, like, we can't serve it. Doesn't matter if you put a transit stop
In
in.
Arcata, we did a project, a housing project, and we had to buy them electric bus. We had to build them a bus charging station, and we had to build a bridge to open up a transit stop to that community. So that was another couple $1 million that we added to the project, but we got it grant funded, but that was not building it. There was a bus stop down that one way, but they wanted to create one going in both directions, and so they needed a bridge to do that over Janes Creek. So that was a project that we were able to pull off that nobody else was. We did, it wasn't a high quality, bus stop, but we increased their capacity or.
Yeah, and I'd say that those two examples are more examples of how we've historically done things, and I think the way that Director Ford envisioned what we would like to try to do is a more proactive approach where the planning happens first.
Yeah.
And the funding
Yeah.
is identified first.
And then when they did a housing project in Hoopa, they had to provide bus transportation. It was a shuttle to bring people, to the bank and to the stores and stuff. So there's other ways to achieve these goals without making it, you got to be by a high-quality bus stop. There could be other types of projects that you could do that enhance transit, but, you come up with, the city came up with them. I just said, give me the price, and I threw in a grant and it got funded, but whatever they wanted, we were willing to try to deliver rather than just dig our heels in and say, well, we can't do this project because there's no high-quality bus stop nearby.
But that's not unlike, it's a completely different type of transit project, but the SMART train. They developed the hubs and the stations first, and now all the infill housing is going in, right, around those. So that's, I guess, what you're saying. It's kind of the reverse planning, if you will, or figure out where we want the hubs and let the development come. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, on a larger scale, that's what has happened in the Bay Area with BART.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So does the way it's worded now accommodate that?
I think it does.
Okay. All right.
And I guess maybe my last comment in terms of the thresholds, I think I'm really struggling on increasing from 50%. I think at the end of the day, it feels like kicking the can down the road. But I know we're almost out of time here, but I would be interested in a few more back and forth conversation on that.
And then Commissioner West?
I think this has been a really helpful, robust conversation on T3, and I like where we're going with it, and am in support of where it's at as proposed tonight. And then similar to Commissioner Curiosity, I'm struggling to deviate from Rincon's recommendation of the 50%, which I believe was called option 1.
Yes.
Before we go down the threshold, dark tunnel, can I just make a really easy suggestion? So this one is for T1. I love that you're planning to partner with HCOG and HTA to identify the grant opportunities for ATP. And so, and I do see that you call out Caltrans, the grants that we award, the sustainable communities, but Caltrans also has within our organization a program to do ATP on our own facilities. And right now, Caltrans, the team in charge of that, selects those priority locations. And I think it would be really beneficial for the county to be part of that conversation, because I think the priority locations we select on, because 101 runs right through the middle of our community. The priority locations we select need to align with the priority locations you're trying to address that are potentially off-system or adjacent. So I know that's not typically how we do that, but I really would urge you to speak to the Caltrans Complete Streets team and become part of that prioritization selection.
Okay, to the threshold dark tunnel. Maybe I can explain what I'm worried about, and then we can figure out how thresholds impact that. So what I don't understand, and maybe I'll use an example, the project that we had last time where we removed the Q zone, right? So that would be an upzoning, I guess. So it would be subject to this threshold if it were, if we had this adopted, right? If a future project adopts all of the measures that are outlined in our plan with respect to electrification of the building and all the different measures, if they adopt those, what threshold are they at? That's what I don't know.
That comes through the EIR process. I see what you're saying. They've streamlined.
If they were, right, are we asking people that are going to be going through the EIR process to achieve a higher level than what we're proposing in the plan? I don't know the answer to that. So do we know if they, would they be at a 50% level or 65 or 70 or 80? I don't know. So that's my question, really, is in all fairness, are we asking people to do more? And
what is more?
Well, I don't know.
So I'm going to try to answer that and ask Kelsey to jump in when I get it entirely wrong. But I believe the 100% is reflective of what it would be if we complied with everything going to 2030. So the percent reduction is taking what the rest of the RCAP would do and then reducing the GHG emission per capita that much more. So that as we head towards 2045, and if you recall that graph that Ms. Acevedo showed, is that it kind of is fairly flat through 2030, but then it gets really steep going down to 2045. And so what this is really trying to do is give us a bit of a head start on 2045. We recognize, this is why we brought it up, we recognize that it seems extremely onerous. And the 50% reduction isn't based upon a number that gets us to 2045. It's a conservative number to help with what's going to happen after 2030.
But the question I think I have similar to his is, what does that mean? What does that translate? Like if I'm building a commercial building and I'm following all the code right now that's required of me, and then I come in and you say, oh, well, you have to meet this 50% threshold. What more do I have to do in this building to meet that threshold?
Without knowing the specifics of the building, I can't answer that.
Well, let's just make up a building then. I mean, I just can't vote on something that I don't even understand what the implications are to a business or, you know, apartment building or something that's coming down the road, what does that mean in terms of cost? Or
That-
measures that they have to incorporate into the project?
Kelsey or Joanna, can you help us with that? Do you have it?
No, bad connection. We
Kelsey,
can't
we're
hear
not
you.
hearing you.
So while she's working on that, so what you're saying is, if they did complete electrification of the home and all the other conditions that were asked for, that would be that would be at the 100% level.
Right.
All right, so.
How do they get to
back
50%?
Yeah, it's like, right, and so, back to the unintended consequences, you're understanding, this is what right, it's like, where are we going with this, and what are the ramifications? And if it's an upzoning that would lead to your transit hub and future development, but it can't be built because we can't meet the 50% reduction on, then we're going backwards. And that's the part I'm struggling with.
You're already looking at prices right now, $400 to $1,000 a square foot to build a commercial project. So that's just to build, and then if you want to put in all the extras like recycled water and all these other things that might get you to the 50%, but I don't know what they are because we don't know, then you don't do the project. You just can't do it. You can't afford it, especially if you have to go get a loan. Now, if you could get a grant, if they still existed, which some of those went away, maybe you could afford to do it like I did in Arcata because I didn't have to pay for the bridge, out of a loan or something. We were able to get state funding to do that. Then I didn't care. You could pile on whatever the state was willing to pay for. But if I was a private developer trying to build something, I just wouldn't do it. I'd go someplace else. And some of the comments that we heard earlier is Humboldt County is not the major contributor here as opposed to other parts of the state. So why are we making it harder than we have to? And I can't even say how hard it is because I don't really know what it would take to get to that 50% level. And just a sample project, I do kind of know because I just tried to get a grant that reduced all of this, and I had to come up with all kinds of different angles to make it sound good.
I guess,
And it added $14 million more to the project, and I wouldn't have been able to do that project if I hadn't gone to get a state grant, and they were willing to cover and pay $1,000 a square foot for projects. But
Yeah.
most developers aren't going to do that.
So, the comparatively high per person threshold, comparatively high to other cities, I think for my read of it is, part of it is because we have additional emissions that we can emit and still technically meet the 1990 or 40% below 1990. So the greenhouse gas emissions inventory concluded that we're below with existing conditions. And then if you look at growth, they look at the emissions from that growth, we can emit more. But past 2030, that's not going to be the case anymore.
I guess so if I
So
said to you, you run
it's going to be
transit.
kicking the can down the road of past 2030 that we don't have that.
But it would be like if you run the transit and I said, okay, right now you have to have all of this stuff. You have to have electric, you have to do all of this stuff, and you have to, or else, you can't operate, and you wouldn't be able to do it unless you had subsidies. And this is the same thing on other types of projects. And so I feel amiss to vote for something that I don't understand what the impacts are going to be, and we're going to be totally, chopping
You can,
ourselves.
you can build luxury homes and put a Tesla in every garage, and you'll meet it.
And live in Santa Barbara.
The impacts are going to be that the impact is going to be climate change if we don't vote on this.
I get that.
And
I'm not against that,
Well,
working on that. But
I understand.
then you're not going to do anything, is my point.
So the fact that this is hard and the fact that this is expensive, is technically not,
This debate that we're having about this, it's got this much to do with climate change.
it does, so.
It's
So I'll go back
It
to-
makes you feel good, and it might make you feel good that you're doing something about climate change, but the amount of development that we're talking about here and the 25% difference in whatever, it's not, I'm telling you that you can do more for climate change with reasonable objectives that bring people along the way on the ride than you will do by setting unachievable, over-the-top objectives that people give up on, that they can't meet, and we won't get there. So
There's other
I
ways
would
to
say
get
that
there.
might be a little bit speculative because Rincon's report stated that the technology and feasibility was there. And
they
so-
stated that nobody has set this goal yet, and that we were somehow going to be a test plot that was going to be somehow influencing other counties. Okay? And I don't think that's what our job is.
Well, it is.
No.
But there's other ways
No,
to
it's
get
to
there.
take care of
That's-
our county. It's to figure out how to achieve these things here. And I just think we're not going to achieve it that way, but we can agree to disagree.
So I'm hearing a lot of passionate voices, and I know we're coming up on the end of our time, so I think at this point, we need to figure out whether or not we are going to bring this to a vote, or whether or not we are going to continue this debate.
I mean, is there a middle ground that could be proposed that would satisfy both needs? So maybe the reduction is half of what is being, what was proposed in the report, or?
I think we're at the middle ground. I would say it should be at 100%.
Or?
I have a proposal, and I've heard that, I've heard the example of housing, and I think housing is one of the main concerns of like limiting housing. We have 3 different thresholds for, new residential, new non-residential, and I forgot what the third one is. Changing the residential threshold. That would, if we took the 75% for residential, that would still be in line with the County of Santa Barbara example that was provided.
Yeah, then we can just change the argument to jobs. So, same argument. And I'm not in favor of necessarily continuing this. I mean, I think a lot of people have put a lot of work into this program over the last 6 years, and I'm not, here to second guess that. I can support staff's recommendation.
Staff is recommending option 2, if I'm remembering correctly.
The 75? But I don't know what that means in terms of the project.
Not sure that any of us really do. It means that we would be passing this along to the Board of Supervisors and let the argument continue.
Could I just point something out?
Yep.
So this, from a screening standpoint, is for projects that are subject to CEQA.
Correct.
Most of the development that occurs in the county anyway is exempt. This would only be where there's an environmental document being prepared.
Correct. Understood.
We probably do 10 of those a year.
I know. So it's relatively minor.
All the projects I did, because of the funding. It's where you get your funding.
But it's a statement, and I think that's where we're having a disagreement. Right.
I think the argument of the scale is where I'm getting hung up, because generally I would agree with everything you've said. But, 10 projects a year that I'm just not sure that the numbers necessitate such a reduction that could potentially further inhibit those numbers. And then your comment about, are we asking folks to achieve a higher bar by using this streamline? I think that.
I just think there's other ways to get
Other
there.
way, yeah, sorry.
There's other ways to get to what you want to do, and I tried to make that example, maybe I didn't do a very good job, but if 50 people have to drive out from Humboldt in their own car, emitting all of this, carbon, and you had a facility that's closer to them, or you bring those services to them, you probably have done more than keeping a business from being built that could employ people because you made it so expensive that they couldn't do it, because it's already expensive. Just doing what you have to do is already getting really expensive, and it's not, like if you're trying to build a house to live in and it's $600 a square foot because now there's tariffs and there's all this other stuff. It's not that you're against, reducing greenhouse gases. You want to live in a house. You want to build a business. You want an office to work in. You want a transit facility. But now you can't do it because you can't get enough money because maybe there's a cap on how much you can get in that grant, And so I just don't know what it's going to require to get to that level that's not already being done. You're already putting solar panels, you're already doing, all electric, you're already doing all the things that you have to do. What more do you have to do to get to that level? And it's an unknown, and how can you force people to do something, that's an unknown, and it could that's already almost impossible to build stuff.
Just remind that in 4 years, it might be lower. So once we redo the cap for 2030.
It might be, but that means for 4 years, we're not going to do those projects that we need to do?
So can I just jump in and say, based on the conversation, would you be, just take a temperature of the room, like willing to support staff recommendation? I mean, it has been a 6-year.
At 50%?
The 75, it's
75.
the option 2. And then on that same note, before you answer to the director, can we include like a asterisk or some sort of note to the Board of Supervisors that just highlights this was something that we had a lot of discussion about and would like their attention on?
We will clearly point that out.
Okay. So then my suggestion would be that we proceed with the staff recommendation, given the amount of work that's been put into it, the amount of public comment, just everything, but let Director Ford update the board and ask them to.
And it would have been nice if you had an example, like I'm building this. There was going to be this fish processing plant. I don't know if that project's still happening, but what would they have to do to get to that level that they wouldn't have originally planned on doing? Just so people know, what are we approving? We're approving a percentage, but we don't know what it means in terms of a real life project. Pick any project and say, I kind of know because I just did one, and I tried to write that grant to get $14 million, and probably $8 million of that was new stuff that wasn't in the project, just to get the carbon reduction that I needed to qualify. So it does add substantial cost to your project, and if it wasn't all state funded, we wouldn't have been able to do it. But I did prevent all these people from having, if they build the project, from having to come out here, which reduced a lot of travel time.
And those should be given credit for. And I think that they will be if there has to be CEQA done. I mean, those kinds of projects.
Those are mitigation factors that I think need to be built into the approval of the project, and not requiring them to do all these things if they can show other advantages.
Yeah, early on when the GHG thing began, there was a shopping center I worked on as a planner. It was right between two population centers. And what that meant is that everybody that lived in that area now neither had to drive to that city or to that city. And so we found that the VMT was actually reduced.
Right.
And so there are those kinds of things that happen. The struggle that we often have is just we have to quantify that. And what you're doing now is creating a threshold. of how much GHG emissions is going to be allowed before it's considered a significant, potentially significant adverse impact.
But if they could turn around
So-
and say, but we have a grocery store.
But let me finish. So, but then there are things that they can do to reduce those emissions. You see, it doesn't just say you can't do it. It says if these things are in this condition, now you've got to evaluate how to reduce that.
Okay.
And it may be that there is other creative things like you're talking about that are done to accomplish that.
Like we'll put a shuttle in and bring the employees in by a shuttle.
Exactly.
Okay.
So then I think at this point, I would make a motion to adopt the resolution to certify the EIR, adopt the mitigation monitoring reporting program, adopt the resolution to make all required findings for the RCAP, and CEQA GHG emission thresholds are consistent with all the changes staff suggested on slide 14 of their presentation tonight, and the request that the director speak with the Board of Supervisors to specifically look at the option 2 threshold level that we've selected.
We have a motion.
Can I add to that would be the additional changes to the resolution that I had requested?
Yes, so it'd be
Changes.
slides, so the changes on slide 14, the resolution changes that were suggested. Are there any others?
No, I think Commissioner Kirazi was the only one that made comments on the resolution.
Awesome. And then moving forward with alternative 2, but requesting the Board of Supervisors take a deep look at that 75%,
But the 75 is the recommendation.
consistent with alternative 2.
Yep.
Okay.
Is there a way, like in other projects, let's say they can't meet the 75, but then they come forward and they ask for a special exemption or something like we do on signage and everything else, that no one wants to follow our ordinance? Is that built into this?
So this doesn't have implications on the permit. It has implications on what kind of environmental document needs to be done.
Okay.
And, I mean, the implication is that if you can't meet that, you do an EIR.
You have to do an EIR,
Yes.
then you don't do the project, probably.
So I have a motion. Do I have a second? I'll second the motion. So I have a motion and second. Do I have any discussion on the motion? Could I have a roll call vote, please?
Ivor Scobdahl,
Yes.
Peggy O'Neill,
Yes.
Sarah West,
No.
Jerome Kirasi,
Are we flipping, I heard? Are we kicking the can?
Yeah, I really have to vote, don't I?
You can abstain.
you could abstain, there's still one more vote after you.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to say no.
Lauren McFarland.
I recognize this was all a difficult decision, but in light of the 6 years of work that was put into it, I support staff's recommendation, so I'll vote yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
I'd like to say that
You made me feel guilty, and then you voted.
I'd like to say that I'm very happy that this RCAP passed. This planning commission is going to the board, and congratulate staff and all their hard
Yes,
work.
a lot of work went into this, and a lot of people in the community were engaged. Okay, no items pulled from consent. Report from planner. Anything to report?
Just, you already know that your action on the McKinleyville town center resulted in it going on to the board. It's going to the board at a special meeting on Monday morning.
Oh, wow.
And I
Isn't there
don't,
like a group forming and having meetings to attack this?
A lot of opposition.
there are, and there's at least 2 different form letters that are going around.
They were
And
having a meeting somewhere.
when I come in and open my email, there is nothing but clerk of the board, clerk of the board, clerk of the board, all the way down. So,
Okay. Any planning commissioner discussion items? Director Ford, can I ask that you bring back a discussion on how social media plays into our reviews, and like, you know, when there are these neighborhood social media groups that might be responding to a particular item on our agenda, and one of us happens to live in a neighborhood and the others don't, how do we, you know, we all subscribe to our own social media channels, and some of us might be privy to something that the rest of the commission hasn't seen. How do we address that?
will do.
Thank you. Any other planning commissioner discussion items? Next meeting, November 6th. Thank you. A lot of work.